we should probably, unless we're planning on doing 2 sessions, it's going to take.
Hope, but let's try not to do 2 sessions. I mean, there's so much, we planned so much for the next couple of weeks. I think it would be a pity in the first meeting to already not respect that.
Yeah, our schedule,
Yeah. Can you guys see this okay? Like, or is it too, like, to read this? Great.
Yeah, I see it.
Dennis, I made you a co-host also, so if you want to share your screen at some point.
Okay, great. Yeah, I might do that just for one or 2 slides. Yeah.
So just to begin, then, and others can join as we go. I think I'm already recording. Just confirm. Yeah. We distinguished, like, we separated 6 kind of points to cover today. The first is just something we agreed last meeting to do as a general kind of suggestion, which is to try to contextualize what we're presenting now with regards to stuff that we already worked on, like, and other people in the group, other people also worked on. Then I think that we're doing something that is quite important that was missing in the presentations on the primer, which is to talk a bit more about what we call this compositional point of view, or something like the conceptual companion to this formal approach, right? How are you thinking about these things when you're using these tools? Like, what is, like, say, the grammar of your theory, right? And we return to this many times. I hope that today's presentation can be seen as a long example of what it means to apply this to something, right? And I think more specifically, there is one thing we're kind of developing, and I think that Dennis gave a really, really nice solution. I know that this is part of the reason why he's reading type theory now, I imagine. To this, I kind of first determination of scale sensibility to our approach. So we don't talk much about scale or scale dependence in this sort of big, strong sense in the primer, but there is a more subtle way in which it already appears, which is this idea of resolution. So it appears twice in the primer, once in section 2, where we introduce this idea of resolution in general, and then in section 14, when we talk about what we call resolution boxes. So the idea is to go over these things again, because we will need them. They are from within this compositional point of view, the idea of resolutions is probably the thing we're going to be exploring the most today. And the first way we explore it is precisely trying to understand in which sense is looking at labor in terms of quantities of time is a particular resolution of all the forms you can look at labor, right? So this will be point 4. And then once we get going with this compositional discussion that's scale sensitive to labor, we will go totally crazy and talk about how this allows us to discuss cooperation, manufacture, and modern industry, which are 3 big chapters of volume 1 of Capital, from this compositional perspective, and then end on a sort of big picture of, let's say, capitalist novelty, and compare it with what could be a different form of concrete novel construction that we hope to explore in the future a bit more. In the next text we want to write, the next 100-page primer we try to write. So the first part, and Dennis, I'm not sure if perhaps I can kind of head the discussion here on the contextualization, but then perhaps you can take the lead on the 2 other points, since you also wrote most of the slides there.
Yeah, I can do 2 and 3. Yeah.
Okay. So the idea here is just to show how this presentation fits in the general research project we're doing, so people can also localize themselves in this, see like how this might be useful to things we've been discussing, and how we also are building on upon the stuff that others already did as well. So the first thing is that we have this kind of egg, or I don't know, like a geological stratus of the research, right? We did this before, like I think last time we met, we tried to organize a bit different levels of our commitments in the research group, right? Which we don't share the same commitments, but there are some presuppositions which are similar, and those have a specific reading or specific version or interpretation in the case of the primer that Dennis and I wrote, because we explicitly say there that we're kind of dividing these different regions, right? We could say that the tools and the methods that we're using to study are coming from Badiou's logics of world. So it is, we're interested and we're applying in a way his philosophical understanding of category theory. We're interested in the sort of new mathematical theories of logic and how it connects with computational logic, type theory, etc., and so on. But mostly it comes into the picture as a sort of toolkit, a sort of different instruments we can use to do something, right? But it's totally underdetermined in Badiou's philosophy what you use these things for, which worlds you're interested in, what counts as novelty. None of that he goes into detail, because he couldn't. Otherwise, he would be kind of going against the grain of his own project, which is all about constructing a very robust framework to be filled locally and enriched locally by actual experimentation and engagement, right? So from Badiou, we take these tools and methods, and then from Bogdanov, we're taking this sort of general point of view, right? Which is what Bogdanov calls the organizational point of view. And from our readings of Bogdanov, from other meetings, we saw that this organizational point of view is sort of a relativistic theory of organization, right? It is scale sensitive in the sense that what counts as a part and what counts as a whole changes depending on the organization under consideration. It's relational in the sense that what counts as activity, what counts as resistance, also changes depending on the perspective. It's very much entangled with the problem of complexity, economy, energy, and so on. So there is a sort of point of view which makes things that are substantially distinct, like culture and economy or nature and society, become relatively distinguished based on different forms of organization. So we can say that this is a sort of point of view we take in this project. But the point of view and the methods don't define that much. So there's still a more specific restriction, which is to look for materials, but use these tools, and from the point of view of organization, analyze social formations, right? More specifically, analyze a sort of continuity between political and economic forms, which is something you already find in Karatani, because Karatani has this idea of modes of exchange, and they don't really define like a base and a superstructure. What counts as base and superstructure is actually locally organized depending on how these modes interact, and forms of politics. So free association in a commune is not thought with a separate framework. You use the same modes of exchange to describe what's singular about a commune and how it's different from, let's say, the status quo of the modern state or whatever, right? So we're using the organizational point of view and formal tools coming from logics of roles to look at social formations in Karatani sense. But the primer does something more specific than that. We restrict this to look specifically at the logic of value and capitalist valorization. We say in the primer that this is not what a social formation is, right? A social formation for us is a multi-layered structure. It has the logic of value, but other logics that are entangled with it. And we define in section 8 very briefly how to distinguish these things, right? What we call the dominant transcendental C, the subdominant transcendentals B and A. And we don't go all the way with Karatani because we don't say that something exists that should be called mode D. as if it's guaranteed by some previous transcendental logic. What Karatani called mode D, we leave open as a space of possible experiments that are not constrained by this particular multi-layered world. So we could say that what we're trying to do, our objective, right, is to use these methods and the organizational point of view to treat the social formations with focus on capitalist logic, to come up with a theory of collective organization as an experimental site for non-capitalist economies. So this little formulation here, it already implies that if you're going to do a theory of experiments, it needs to be underdetermined. So Badiou's sort of underdetermined philosophy that leaves space for experiments is a good idea. It's a theory of organization, so the organizational point of view makes sense. It's meant to connect organization and economies. So Karatani's continuity between politics and economy also makes sense. And for non-capitalist economies. So that means we need to know what the hell capitalist means, right? So it's kind of summed up in this objective, which, as you can see here, we added like a little squiggly circle to show that it goes a bit beyond where Marx goes, right? It's not a general theory of organization in Bogdanov's sense. It's kind of the place where you get the Bogdanovian treatment of things that Karatani talks about that expand what Marx wrote about, perhaps something like that, using category theory. Perhaps that's the simplification we could make to make it to make no one want to read what we wrote. Anyway, this is the egg or the magma schema, right? These are the meetings. I mean, I hope was this clear? Do you guys think this is a good kind of summary of it? Just before we move on, in case there's any questions.
Yeah, I would just add, like, it's almost also like a gravity well, because we're also trying to find a way to escape the inner circle, right? Like, what is the trajectory, or what kind of rocket do we need to build to leave the inner Marx logic and go to the Karatani logic? You know?
Yeah, I like that idea. Yeah, it is a big center of gravity. It's very hard to say anything about capital that is not exegetic, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
I think I do feel that you're right. Like in that sense, we're struggling with that. So this is something just to consider, like some of the meetings we had before that I think are either informing or in dialogue with the stuff that we're doing today. So a very old meeting that Dennis presented a long time ago on compositionality and generative effects based on the doctoral thesis of this guy called Ali Adam. I have the impression, I didn't even discuss this with Dennis, I just added this here. I feel like what Ali Adams does in terms of showing that you can talk about emergent effects, right? And he goes from like actual emergent properties of systems, and includes magic as well, illusions and so on, everything that seems to emerge out of nothing. He gives a treatment of this sort of phenomena that is not based on nonlinear dynamic systems, and the complexity of a system is so high that it leads to some emergent phenomena. He gives it a kind of, he calls it an orthogonal interpretation, where generative effects emerge from the unequal interaction between two systems, right? And this sort of idea of veiling and things like this. So I think it was the first step we took in seeing that there was a discussion of composition and that had a theory of change inside of it that was weaker than Badiou's theory of, you know, subjective eventual change, but it's also kind of inside the same formalism. And in a way, this is what we're going to explore. It's not so obviously the topic today, but if you read the primer, one of the main topics that we're silently developing there is a theory of what we could call weak change, a theory of capitalist novelty, which is novel. It implies that you do create something that didn't have a form before, but it's still distinguishable from strong novelty, which is something that distinction between weak and strong novelty, between what we could call generative effects and proper generic effects. It's something we're gonna pick up later on the presentation if we have time. So I'd say that this was important as a precursor to what we're doing. Then all our readings of Bogdanov, as I said, a sort of relativistic theory of organization, the way that he poses the problem of cooperation as an economic problem. I think it's also very relevant. We're going to go back to Bogdanov with a twist by the end of the presentation as well, due to some interesting Soviet debates that might have connection to what we're doing. Then, of course, the primer of political phenomenology, where pretty much everything we're talking about today is there in a very, very, very condensed form. So we're kind of giving conceptual flesh to some of the ideas that are there, developing them a bit more in some cases. But I think it's a good way to understand this presentation also as a sort of introduction to the point of view of the primer from the perspective of examples in a specific, more specific issue, right? Of how is labor caught up in capitalist production. And I think that the compositional point of view, which is how we call the presentation, it's already a good kind of connector between the formal categorical point of view and the organizational point of view. So if we were to probably give a name to the philosophical perspective, right, rather than calling it organizational, which is a bit more political perhaps, and calling it categorical in the sense of category theory, we could call it compositional. I think it names something about the conceptual grammar or the conceptual language, right? And finally, the presentation Pedro gave last time, which was called Vibing with Algorithmic Socialism, where we debated Benanav's text and Pedro's critiques of people who see certain limits in the use of technology and what's called digital socialism and so on. So there is some of the questions that we raised and some of the debates that happened in last meeting. I think they are kind of picked up here, especially when we talk about machines and things like this. I think it might give a richer picture of the opposite, perhaps, or not necessarily the same position as Pedro presented. And to conclude, I just added some other remarks at the bottom. I think that there are a lot of connections today as well with discussions on capitalism, what Caron was talking about, space of reasons and ways of parsing reality in terms of concepts that cohere consistently in a picture of the world and so on. I think there's a lot of this going on today, but from our slightly different perspective. I think that something that Renzo presented a long time ago in his presentation on integrated information theory and this sort of measure of effective complexity based on possible partitions of a system, right? There is a strong vibe of partitions and complexity going on today, I think. And also something that Raquel presented, I think in the first meeting, when we were talking about, I think it was just Dennis, Raquel, and I, about the transformation problem and ways that we can formalize and think in more detail about how changes in scale, which in our case here will be called changes in resolution, right? How these changes that are not really temporal nor spatial, they're changes in something else. How these changes can affect how you measure something, right? And in the specific case Raquel was dealing with, how they affect the very form of price. So why is it that accidentally looked locally, prices are simple prices, considered from the perspective of average profit rates of a sector, they are market prices. Considered as the splitting of total average profit rates, they become production prices. I mean, I just summarized this in this way, which is something Raquel and I have been discussing like last week. At the time, we had no idea how to talk about this, but I think we're also moving forward with that in a nice way. So just to give a sort of contextualization of things that I think might be in a sort of underlying discussion as we go along. I'm not sure, Dennis, if you want to add anything before we move.
Yeah, I mean, the last point you brought up is really, really important, because I would say even like the heart of the whole categorical thing, why we think category theory is a nice tool here, is because we can make sense of the question about like price, and why is it that price or money in one context has a certain meaning, and another context it becomes capital, and category theory is really good for describing things in this functionalist paradigm, right? Like things are what they can do in some sense.
In a context, right?
Yeah, in a certain context. Yeah, and then defining that context is the battle really for category theory.
It's interesting. I've heard this about category theory, that is, people think it's not doing anything because it's usually very descriptive, right?
Yeah.
Like you usually want to prove a law, a pattern, or a regularity about a structure, and you think you need to funnel in to look at some specific correlation. And category theory tends to look at the context, that if you describe the context determinations properly, those restrictions of the structure follow naturally, right? So rather than saying, why does something work in this way by looking into it, you just look at everything that's happening outside of it, that's interacting with it, and that kind of gives you the negative of the limits of its possibility, right?
Exactly. Yeah. And then that scales in some sense, because even the category itself is, once you've delimited it properly, you can now import knowledge or information from other categories and explore the space as a whole, which is I think is something that we try to do with the functors and resolutions.
Yeah, Yasha was saying here that this association is also because in the practice of mathematics, category theory is often used to set up the context of the problem that's usually is, right? Outside.
Yeah, that's right.
Sorry, yeah?
Yeah, exactly. That's what I've heard too, that setting up the context is like the hardest part, really. Once you do that, it's you can then use a lot of tools that
I love it. It has a Leninist tinge to it, that if you do the concrete analysis of the concrete context, politics is halfway done, like if you describe the situation the correct way, the path is like becomes clearer, which is I mean, it's not necessarily how most people think about politics, but I think that in our particular case, it's different because, or not different. I mean, it doesn't look like it's a preamble to something else, because in a way, what we are saying that is missing is a descriptive capacity, right? The actual, we could put it in this way, right? I think that the actual situation of the world is so subtle or so difficult to describe that a lot of contextual properties and restrictions are treated as characteristics, intrinsic characteristics of an object. So, for example, to give an example, when I did that presentation on the book that I wrote with my friend here in Brazil, and I was suggesting that we should read problems in the leftist organizations as effects of the context of peripherization, right? The idea there is that if you understand the context properly, a lot of characteristics that you associate with the object. So you would say, these leftists are corrupt, or those leftists don't want to play ball, right? When you realize that the context these structures are inscribed in already imposes some of these restrictions, right? You can choose the battles better, something like this. So I think for politics, the value of description, especially in a moment of kind of crisis of cognitive mapping, it has a added value than simply being a sort of preparational work for something else.
Yeah, that's important. And it's something we didn't fully explore yet, because we're trying to get out of this gravitational pull of capital so that we can explore these other kind of implicatives landscapes, right?
Anyway, so just to continue, I think that this is now the time where you probably should pick up, just so we can.
Then do you want me to share the screen, or
would you want? You can either use mine or you can just exchange and you share it.
Yeah, I'll share it. Okay, so we are here. Okay, yeah, so compositional point of view. Here we can kind of summarize the main ideas of our use of category theory without actually having to, dive into it. But I know Yasha gave a great presentation on it a while back. And I think sometime in the future, we'd like to revisit like the details of it. But I think in this presentation, we'll just kind of talk like high level, what themes make it so that category theory is the right tool for analyzing this kind of stuff. Or as this says here, conceptual grammar, right? Okay, so I have a picture here of, I think these are the total exports of Brazil from 2020, broken down by relative percentage, right? So I think this picture kind of captures a certain idea, which is that every commodity, whether it is something you buy at the grocery store or something a nation sells to other nations, can be broken down into smaller parts, right? And those parts are themselves commodities, right? So the compositional point of view is that things of some type, for example, commodities, are made of other things of the same type, so other commodities. And so this is what kind of is the minimal password that you need to get into the world of categories and to make use of categorical tools.
Sorry, I think it's important to say, just because it made me confused when I read the slide at first, that if it looks like things of some type are made of things of other types, it means you probably didn't find the right type to describe it, right?
Sorry, what do you mean?
Like, because of course not everything is made, not all things are made of things of the same type, right? So in the sense that you could say, I don't know, well, now that I think of it, I can't really find an example, but
yeah, that's a good point. I mean, if you have something that's made up of things of a different type, I think the wager that category theory puts forward is that you can kind of lift that up to some more general thing, right? That's why, like, I think commodity is such a open-ended concept that commodities don't even have to be physical things. They can be just ideas, even given the proper, like, let's say, constraints from the other layers, like we've outlined.
Yeah.
But in some sense, in order for a category to be coherent, yeah, you do need a single type of thing. But this type can be so minimal, so undetermined that you can fit a lot of things in there. Yeah. So in this case, like, this is exactly why it's so crazy to see all these different things on the same picture, right? What does crude petroleum and gold have in common, or ferroalloys and poultry meat, right? They are not of the same type, but in some sense there is something that makes them, right? I mean, this is the whole point of Marx's opening passages, that they all require labor, would be one answer for why they could belong in the same picture. But yeah, in a categorical sense, we just want some overarching concept to kind of cover this space. Okay, so this is just briefly what the compositional point of view is. And so compositionality is to be separated from categorical perspective, right? They're two different things, but the reason that categories kind of fit very nicely into the compositional view is that they add an additional feature, which is that it's the transformations of a thing that determine it. So rather than, because you could say like, oh, isn't set theory also about composition, right? A set is made up of other sets. So why move to categories? The answer is that sometimes you don't want to look directly inside, or you cannot look directly inside of a thing to make sense of it. Instead, you can see how that thing interacts with other things of the same type. So that's what this is saying. To study a thing of some type and its internal composition is to study a collection of transformations. And this collection can be arbitrarily big, right? It can be a vast collection. And the question becomes how can you restrict that set of transformations? It doesn't even have to be a set. It can be a class. And mathematically, that's even bigger than a set, right? So we want to apply this operational view or categorical view to the two kinds of transformations that characterize commodities, which are productive transformations and exchange transformations, which is just normally exchanging things for each other. And here's two basic facts, right? If I produce B from A and C from B, then I can produce C from A, right? I can take whatever process, it can take however long from A to B. And it can be, involve different numbers of people. It can involve different technologies. But if that process exists, and if a process exists to convert B to C, to turn B, which B can be a collection of things as well, right? Counted as one, let's say. If I can turn A to B and B to C, then I can turn A to C. That's compositional and operational at the same time. Similarly, if I can exchange A for B and B for C, then I can exchange A for C, right? So this enchainment of operations, this is actually where the composition appears, right? Not so much looking inside a thing and like opening it up and seeing what's inside, but rather seeing what's inside the set of transformations. Now, there's a fundamental theorem in, or I guess a lemma in category theory that says that those two procedures are the same. Looking inside of a thing and taking it apart is the same as looking at its set of operations and opening that box up and looking, for the different classes and different ways you can partition the set of transformations. Okay, so we want to apply this to these two classes of transformations, production and exchange. Again, there's two aspects to composition. There's building things up and breaking them down. And in some sense, they are the same, right? They contain the same information. If I know how a thing is built, then I also know how to break it out into its parts, its constituents. So in the case of our paper and the thing we're trying to do in the research in general is we want to be able to isolate the parts of capital. The inner logic of capital is already there. It's not something we invented, but rather it's something that exists every day. It's permeates, right, our lives. So it's not so much about building up the logic of capital as figuring out how to find the parts of it, right? Because at first it just seems like one mass of things, right? If to go back to the previous example, we know these two things, that you can produce things and you can exchange things, but that doesn't necessarily give us a logic to it. And you could say maybe economics is a way of trying to break that down further to show the interrelationships between production and exchange. But we want to approach it, from a different angle. So in order to do this, we have this method, which is basically a category theory method, which is restricting the set of operations down using logical predicates. So we call this the method of logical restrictions. So basically any concept that we can come up with should correspond to some restriction of operations. So we already did this implicitly in the previous by talking about the concept of production and exchange. We've already limited our set of total transformations of commodities to two classes. So we've already restricted at this point. And now the goal is to restrict further, to find other predicates, other useful concepts that can extract information from these very large sets. So here an example. We may not know all the forces that act on a physical body, but we can talk about the effect of gravity in particular. So obviously a falling body is not just affected by gravity or a body moving in space. It's affected by many, many things. We would not get anywhere if we needed to know all the forces before we could say something about the movement of that physical body. We have to be able to talk about different forces in isolation first. So just the metaphor here is that we may not know all the uses of a commodity, but we know it can be used to make a chair, for example. So this means, this shift in perspective means that we don't start assuming that we know what commodities are. We start with, we don't know all the things that a commodity can do or what it can be used for, but we need to restrict down from the set of all things to particular things. And we care about studying like case by case the uses of a particular thing. So this is how the method of logical restrictions works. We, I don't know, I think for me, it's interesting because, or it's very nice because you don't have to know everything about the commodity. So we can kind of localize our search for particular phenomena. And in this presentation, in particular, we want to focus on labor, right? Labor is a particular kind of commodity, and we don't know everything that labor is capable of, right? That's a fundamental premise of our of this presentation, is that we don't know everything labor is capable of. So capital has restricted the set of what labor is capable of to things which make more money, right? Make value. And so we want to understand that boundary line. What kind of restriction is this? Okay, so here is a kind of a picture of what I was saying earlier, that we have on the left here a circle containing all uses in general. So this can be things that have nothing to do with commodities. We can use a chair in a way that, kind of removes it from the commodity world, in a sense. It just becomes an object in the world. We could, set it on fire, or, use it to make art or something like that, right? And it doesn't necessarily go back into the circuit of the commodity world, although it's questionable where that is, right? I mean, finding a space outside of capital is also like not a trivial thing to do. So it's not to say that there's some easy formula for doing that, but let's say, for example, that there are things you can do that are not commodity preserving. So then we go one level deeper. We have commodity preserving operations. So we say in the paper that these are operations that the end result still has exchangeables and uses. So we define in the paper 2 sets for every commodity: the set of things it can be exchanged with, and then the set of things that it can be used for, right? And I think this is, this was like an important contribution from our discussions, like about what exactly is in those sets. So it's pretty simple, like in exchangeable, the set of exchangeables is other commodities. But in the set of uses, what is a use exactly? For now, we are trying to be more categorical about how we think of uses. And so we're saying that the set of uses are themselves maps, commodity preserving maps.
I think a good way of thinking about what you're saying is, if you go back to that crazy image of all the quantities of kind of primary commodities, right? The first point is that you cannot really ontologically find things in common between them. But if you work with those 2 rules you proposed, right, that things that when they're composed together, they give out a product that can be composed with others in such a way that if you compose together those 2 compositions, that thing is also a process, right? That's the logical definition of commodity production. Things that if they are composed together and become commodities, you can compose them again, take them as the input of the next thing. That will the whole thing together is still a commodity production, right? And in that logical sense, these things are equivalent. Like they can be treated as the same type, even if ontologically they couldn't, right? There's nothing about coffee that is like crude petroleum, but both of them can be caught up in those sorts of transformations, right? And at the same time, both of them can be caught up in transformations such that if I can exchange some amount of petroleum for some amount of coffee and some amount of coffee for some amount of sugar, then I can exchange petroleum for sugar. Again, ontologically, they're totally distinct and we don't really care what they are, right? We will see how their being gets caught up in this logic, but at first we don't really care. But they are, let's say, amenable to be logically, they're available to be logically treated in this way. So we only care for them insofar as they abide to these transformations, right?
Exactly, yeah. That's a really nice way to think about it, because in that sense, the thing we're trying to study when we study the operational space, as we call it, is this commodity, 2 sets of commodity transformations that kind of pull different things into them, right? Like you said, like corn, coffee, they're both kind of enclosed or brought into the field of this, of influence of this process. And yeah, it's like irrespective of what the thing actually is, it can be pulled in.
We could say that commodity is a description of how things are and not really what they are, right?
Yeah.
They are commodity-like insofar as they can be treated in this way, which is also, I think, a good way of thinking about use and exchange, because for us, use is actually commodity use, right? Commodified use and not use in general, right? As Dennis showed here. So you have uses in general of petroleum, which are not even human, the use of turning dinosaur into liquid. I don't care about that, for example, in itself, or it's not something that, a capitalist might worry about it, but it exists. It's a possible transformation of dinosaurs into petroleum, but some transformations of petroleum, so not the dinosaur to petroleum, but petroleum to something else, that preserves the commodity form, right? So that is enough to define a sort of restriction of possible commodity uses for petroleum, right?
Yeah, and this is also brings up a really nice difference between how we're using category theory and how mathematicians might use it. Although I would say, like, with applied category theory, this distinction is not so clear. But in mathematics, once you define a category, that's pretty much it. Like, it's there. It's the set of things that like groups apply to. It's kind of there, and we may discover, let's say, more groups later on. Although I think the all the finite ones have been found, right? But we may discover more of some type of thing. But once you've kind of delimited the boundary of a mathematical world using category theory, it's kind of set. Whereas in this picture here, you can imagine the borders of uses in general and commodity preserving is constantly fluctuating, right? In the case of a world dominated by capital, so a T with a dominant C, as we say in our text, the commodity preserving circle is constantly expanding further out into the uses in general, trying to find from the things that are not commodified already, trying to find ways of bringing that into the orbit of capital. So I mean, that's also interesting, like when we go back to this picture of Badu Bogdanov, where we're actually dealing with a very a dynamic phenomenon, right? Something that's changing in time, has historical properties that maybe a mathematical object would not have. So that's something to consider. Okay, so what we have here is that commodities, there are operations that preserve the commodity form and do not preserve it, right? So how do we apply the method of logical restrictions? We have to come up with a formal language. It doesn't have to be formal. It can be kind of more or less formal, but the more formal it is, the more likely we can kind of transmit these concepts to each other, right? But once we have a formal language, we can specify constraints on the transformations. So that's how we restrict the circles down, right? Here we still have a very low resolution picture because we can only see as far as like exchanging and producing operations, but we want to go even further than that. And so category theory gives us a nice formalism called the diagrammatic language, or the commutative diagram, that is a language that specifies constraints in terms of arrows. So I don't have one. We don't have one in this presentation, but it's basically like any two paths in a commutative diagram have to be the same, right? Once you, if they start and end at the same point. Yeah, exactly.
I think a good way of thinking about it is like, as we said many times, right? If you have only this, it would mean all possible ways, right? But the moment that I add, for example, this restriction, that taking this path needs to be the same as taking this path. In that case, then some of these are no longer possible, and I restricted them to just a more determinate one, right? Exactly. What are the possible paths that can take me here if there's also this other path here going from C and D? Then this needs to be more specific than if I only had this written down, right?
Exactly. Yeah. So if I want to make from uranium electricity, I have the set of all possible ways I can turn uranium into electricity. But if I want to do that in such a way that it, I don't know, preserves something, like preserves the environment or minimizes waste, that would be an example of like restricting our possible ways, right? Although you can already tell, like, maybe that's not even possible with capitalism, because perhaps in order to find a way to produce uranium to electricity, you need something in the middle that's still profitable, like a nuclear power plant that's owned and can be privatized. You can privatize that in some sense. Just an example of how like an arrow can be restricted in ways that perhaps the commodity world cannot even see. Okay, so in addition to this diagrammatic language, we can also talk about this slightly more advanced thing, which is the internal language of a category. But they're almost the same, right? So every statement of this internal language corresponds to a particular object in this category. This is an extension of what we've been saying, which is that to talk about objects, we need logical restrictions. Every time we restrict our space of operations, we're also specifying an object that contains those operations or is determined by those operations, right? So if we take this method all the way, then that means our language and our objects are one-to-one, right? Every concept in our language corresponds to some object in this category. And this viewpoint is called categorical semantics. Basically, the objects of the category are the semantics for the transformations, or for the language, right? And it's possible that the internal language of a category is not sufficient to characterize something that we're trying to characterize. So again, using the example, I have uranium, I have electricity, I want to make electricity, but I want to do so in such a way that it's not bad for the environment, let's say. Maybe that's just physically impossible, but maybe it's only impossible within capitalism, right? So then if it's impossible in one domain of let's say of commodities, then we can embed this in a larger category, let's say the category of uses in general. And then maybe we'll find a logical restriction that is non-empty, right? There does exist a transformation from uranium to electricity that is not bad for the environment. Okay. Okay, so then, okay, so this brings us to the idea of resolution. So we've been talking about this in our group a lot, about scale, sensitivity, resolution, and I came up with Gabriel and I, we've been discussing this example of fractals, right? We talked a lot about in the Tal's book in previous meetings, but just for now, I want to talk about really kind of hand-wavy metaphor for the logical restrictions again. So on the right here, we have this thing called the Julia set, which is a collection of points that obey a certain condition. And the animation here shows how this condition can be seen at different levels, which I'm going to say corresponds to a notion of resolution, right? Every point in the complex plane, which is the plane made up of the real numbers as the kind of one axis and the imaginary numbers as another axis, every point on that plane can be described with two numbers, right? One real number, one complex number. And it's actually those things together actually form one number called the complex number, right? So it's one real and one imaginary component. And the Julia set is the set of all points such that the complex number squared plus some constant complex number does not diverge as you apply it successively. There's a recurrence relation, okay? I can show a quick example of this.
Yeah, the important thing about this is that it's the recurrence relations that you take a simple function like a quadratic and you plug it into itself many times and you see what happens. So everything outside of the Julia set goes to infinity eventually.
Yes.
And everything inside will converge in some way. So sometimes it does like weird, like it does like cycles. Sometimes it just goes around randomly. So like.
Exactly. Yeah. So yeah, in reality, you have to plug it in an infinite number of times, right? A Julia set is actually specified up to infinity.
Yeah.
The operation has to be applied. But obviously we cannot actually apply it infinite numbers of times, at least not with computers or with our brains or anything like that. So Julia sets are kind of out of our reach in terms of being able to specify them fully. So the metaphor here is that resolution corresponds to the number of iterations that you run the the recurrent relation on the points. So I have this code that I took from the blog, and I just ran it for different numbers of maximum iterations. So this Julius set was run for 10 times. So after 10 times of applying the relation, we decide like these are the things that converged and these are the things that diverged. And if you look at this, you have this kind of vague shape forming, and then you can increase that number of iterations and you get something a little more defined, and you can double that and get something more defined, and eventually you start to get what appears to be like a full fractal pattern, right? So this idea, which I hope is not too belabored, but this metaphor I want to say is how capital views the productive process, right? Capital is trying to find what it can take of some larger world and make it profitable, make it value producing. So here I said, like, at the zero level, commodities are an undifferentiated mass. If you constrain too little, you cannot really capture the logic of capitalism, because it's like everything is capitalism. Okay, that doesn't tell us anything. But if we constrain too much, we go ahead of where capitalism actually is, and we start talking about things that capitalism has not yet captured into its logic. So we have to find the right resolution, which is actually a range of resolutions to view this phenomenon, right? So capital is not infinite in the sense of a Julius set. It's actually moving at a certain rate, which is determined by historical properties, but it has, included certain things into the set of commodifiable things, and we are trying to figure out like where's the contours of this, and that corresponds to the resolution. Okay, so as an example, to make a wooden pencil, I don't need a particular wood from a particular tree. I need a type of wood, right? So from my perspective as a pencil producer, I want cedar, for example. And I don't really care if this comes from a particular region necessarily. Like I could get cedar from California or some other part of the United States or outside of the United States. I do care about the price though, right? So this is how resolution kind of comes into play, right? To make wooden pencils profitably, I have to consider the cost of the wood and the materials, other materials, the cost of labor, the cost of land, all the like kind of logistical stuff that would impact my bottom line. But I don't need to see really what my worker likes to do in his free time. I don't really care about the life of the worker outside of my production process, right? That's why I pay the worker, so I don't have to care about that kind of stuff. So this is an example of how like capitalism imposes a particular resolution on the world. So certain things don't matter, right? Where the wood comes from necessarily, or exactly which tree the wood comes from, but other things do matter. Things that impact profitability.
I think another way of talking about it is to say that a resolution in this case defines the boundary between where differences make a difference and where differences don't make a difference, right?
Mm-hmm. Yes, and again, this is a dynamic thing because maybe right now the type of wood, like I just think cedar wood is fine. Any kind of cedar wood would make a great pencil. But then let's say my competitor comes out with a new pencil that's a particular kind of cedar wood that's grown in a particular type of environment, and those pencils are particularly good. They don't break easily. They feel better when you write with them, and suddenly his profits go up. I start losing market share to my competitor. Now my resolution of what matters for pencil making will change. So there is a kind of constraint passing between different capitals, and we'll talk more about that in the later slides. But in the latter part of the paper, we talk about it as well. But resolution is a dynamic thing, right? And it's determined by these kind of explorations into the process, production process itself. Okay, so we have this resolution. How do we propose slicing up the world of commodities? So on the right here, we take this again operational approach. So to interpret this kind of, whenever you see a parenthesis, that means it's an arrow or it's an operation that goes from the first term in the parentheses to the second term, and asterisks mean that it can be anything, right? So C comma asterisk means all commodities. So that's this entire set of things. And then we have ways of slicing up this world of commodities into chunks, right? One would be this top left pink box is commodities that can be excluded from the capitalist process. They're kind of what we call layer excluded. And the thing on the right are commodities that get consumed. C comma 1 means operations from C to 1, which that's how we represent consumption. But then the bottom left is kind of the interesting world here, or at least more relevant for capital, which is all productive commodities. So commodities that can be used for production. And of those we can divide it into three. We have natural means of production, so things which were not produced themselves, but are now being pulled into production, right? Like aspects of nature that pre-existed capitalism. Private means of production, so commodities that we've produced that now go into further productive processes. And then labor power, right? This presentation is focused on this blue box of labor power, but it's within this larger kind of partition. Okay, and that's basically how we can apply the thing on this, all this stuff about the endofunctor. So we call this a delta resolution. It's an endofunctor from the category of commodities to itself. And this functor forgets differences. So every commodity is actually the outcome of a resolution. There's actually no commodity that can be specified without some kind of endofunctor in the first place of having been applied to it. So there's kind of a maybe a paradox, a chicken or egg paradox here. Like, how can we have the category if there are no resolution independent commodities? But in this case, I think it's okay. So for example, pine and cedar wood can be mapped to rot resistant wood. So that's a functor. A functor is a transformation from one category to itself, right? To another category. But in this case, it's being applied to itself. So one resolution would see that pine and cedar wood are just two kinds of rot resistant wood. But at a different resolution, pine wood itself is the result of forgetting some differences. So there's subspecies of pine in the world. As a pencil maker, I might not care about those differences. So from my perspective, from the perspective of the capital that produces pencils, it doesn't matter if it's white pine or sugar pine, right? So certain properties are relevant for certain operations. That's the main point. And our category, our operational space of C actually contains all commodities at all resolutions. So it's we have the same commodity that can exist in different registers, let's say, right? Pine wood in one resolution can be pencil making wood. At a different resolution, it's like the wood you would use to make a chair, but it's the same commodity. So that I think the delta resolution is useful because it allows us to explore this operational space in a way that corresponds to the use sets, right? For every use set, you can create a new delta resolution, and you can kind of dive further into the operational space, far more than this picture on the right shows, right? This picture on the right is just like a low res picture. Okay, so here we get into kind of more experimental stuff. So I've been reading about type theory and its relation to categories. And in the previous slides, we talked about like there's an internal language. So every logic is actually logic over a set of types. Set theory has its own logic, and it only has one type, which is set, right? Everything's a set. So it's what some people would call a single sorted logic. In the case of capital commodities, we don't have a single sorted logic because not any type of commodity is allowed to be in a operation, right? You need specific operations from one type to another. So so category theory is kind of this also a space to investigate different logics and different type theories. Okay, so one way to think about how types work in this space is by looking at this monad, which actually the next slide is about the monad, but in this case, we can talk about two different resolutions, which on the left here, we'll see pencil is a type, and it contains the wood. So wood becomes one thing that's being used to make pencils. And here, this is like aluminum, right? Aluminum is being used maybe to make like the little metal piece on the pencil, or maybe the letters. But these two things can also be used to make chairs. So we kind of have this hierarchy of types where these kind of base things can be considered to be subtypes of kind of a more general type, right? Or if you're in programming, maybe a more apt description of this is like a generic type, right? So chairs are kind of generic over the elements used to produce a chair. Okay, so this is kind of a way to add structure to these objects in such a way that we can start talking about process that needs not specifically any tree, but a tree of pencil producing qualities. Okay, and then this naturality square just lets us say that given two commodities of one resolution, there is a natural transformation turning those two commodities into two commodities of a different resolution, such that this, like taking the top arrow and going down is the same as going down and to the right. So this is a constraint, right? So this is kind of experimental because we didn't really make use of it that much later on. I think the only real use we talk about it a few times, but one main use of it is using money as a kind of a basic type of resolution, where all the different, if you think about money, it's kind of interchangeable, right? The money I have in my wallet is indistinguishable from the money in your wallet in some sense. Besides, we have different owners, but the quality, the properties of money itself are the same. So we can say that in a world dominated by money or capital, money is there's a money compatible resolution. But let's say in the world dominated by, let's say, pencil making, right? There might be a pencil making resolution, and then all commodities would be judged by their capacity to be part of the pencil making process, right? So that's kind of the interpretation of this, right? We're trying to reduce
just to clarify a bit, the general kind of more conceptual use is also that this turns qualitative distinctions into this approach to the sphere of use, which is usually the sphere of quality. In this case, it becomes just a differential space that if you choose some kind of resolution, you are also committing to some other things, right? So kind of qualitative distinctions are reduced to combinations of how you restrict the set of use and what sort of composition this allows for, right? Just to clarify that it's a sort of compositional view of quality, right?
Mm-hmm.
As you said, like, we don't care what Setter is ontologically. What matters is that considered restricted to some aspect, it composes to become a pencil. Restricted in some other aspect, it composes to become a chair. And you can kind of slice the use set of cedar wood based on those restrictions, right?
Yes.
So just to clarify, are you saying that this alpha natural transformation, you can kind of interpret it as transforming between the way that different commodities change under change of scale, or different, not commodities, but commodity transformations change under change of scale, right? Or something like that?
Yeah.
And in that you get something qualitative from that.
Yeah.
Yeah,
exactly. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Kind of like saying you can shift registers from wood as pencil making wood to wood as chair making wood, and preserve some kind of like, there's like a natural way to go about this, right? And again, the D here would be like relations between wood and some other commodity under that resolution. So then there's a natural way to kind of shift from one productive process to another, right? If every resolution is like a productive process, seeing the world in a particular way.
I think it will become clearer once we start like getting into the examples of labor and so on.
Yeah. Okay. So then, yeah, one even crazier idea is that there's a connection between endofunctors and monads, and I didn't really have time to develop this, but yeah, the idea is that if you have an endofunctor that obeys these two diagrams, you have a monad, and the monad is basically three things, right? It's this delta symbol, which is the endofunctor, and it has these two natural transformations, eta and mu, such that this commutes. And the interpretation here is simply that we have the resolution monad, but we also have the reverse of the resolution, which we wrote as this upside down triangle, which is all the things that would be counted the same under that resolution. So if you were to apply this endofunctor, one thing is about forgetting differences, right? The regular triangle forgets differences between graphite, wood, eraser, labor. The other one expands your space because it takes a commodity which would have been composed of indistinguishable parts, and it maps it to the product object containing the parts of that commodity. So here, for example, if we were to apply this other endofunctor, the upside down arrow triangle, we would get graphite multiplied by wood, multiplied by eraser, multiplied by labor, right? Or the product commodity. So this is kind of two two ways, and I'm not sure if maybe you could say they're adjoint ways. I think they are, right? They're kind of determine each other.
I think only partially, because, for example, the things that go into making a lamp cannot be necessarily recuperated when you consider the parts of the stuff that went back to the lamp, right? Like the aspects of things that govern their composition in production are not necessarily remembered when you backtrack from the produced object back onto its components.
Yeah, I think it's not saying that there's a way to recover those commodities. So it's not that I can simply.
No, I mean even the sense of recovering the predicates.
Oh, okay.
Right. I mean, can you? When I see a commodity that, from its perspective, made a bunch of things indifferent amongst each other, right? So I see a pencil. I don't see specific graphite. I see that some graphite, right? I don't care for further distinction. Or the eraser, only that there is some form of petroleum-based eraser there, but where it came from doesn't matter. Like you lose some of that information. Okay, something is going on here.
Yeah.
I don't think they're shots. I think it's not gunshots. Might be this. I don't know who's playing today.
That sounds trouble, like trouble. Okay.
It doesn't sound like gunshots though. Like it sounds like fireworks.
Oh, okay.
Which is not necessarily a good thing either, but we'll see if it gets worse. But yeah, I'm just not sure if talking about, let's say, the resolutions under which commodities are considered, the predicates that are relevant for them as parts of a production process, are the predicates that you can decompose the produced commodity once it's done. Not like they can get back, reverse entropy, the original commodities, but I'm not sure if the predicates are preserved, you know?
Yeah, preserved by what?
Yeah, I'm trying to understand, like, in which sense is this recuperatable by the inverse delta thing?
Oh, yeah. So it's only in the sense that when you look at a commodity, you should be able to see, like, if every resolution is like the glasses that you can put on to see commodity as indistinguishable, you should be able to find the inverse glasses, which lets you see something that was indistinguishable as distinguishable. But not in the sense that there is a productive process that can.
No, I didn't think in terms of productive process. I'm just thinking in terms of recuperating, again, that some graphite, like if water went to mixed with some chemical component to make something, the predicates of the produced thing might be totally different from the predicates that went into its making. So, for example, if there was a necessary catalyst, right? We don't care for which catalyst it was, but it's not in the sense of recuperating the objects or the commodities, but in the sense of even seeing the stuff that went into it.
Yeah. Actually, you're right. I think maybe this one is done wrong because it's not so much that you see from a pencil its constituent parts, but you see from, let's say, graphite, you can see all the different types of graphite that were maybe forgotten.
I see. Okay. Yeah.
Under pencil making.
You can see this indifferentiated graphite as part of a family of graphites.
Yeah. I think that makes more sense. Yes.
Would that be kind of connected to like a bargaining space then in the earlier theory, like it becomes comparative to others based upon the pricing?
Yeah, I don't know if the relation with the pricing, but I mean, certainly when you're trying to produce something, you have to buy it. So
Yeah, because I mean, you're not talking about decomposing the commodity into its priceable parts. You're talking about like seeing the commodity now, where things were differentiated for it to, from its perspective, as being seen by the general types that it is a special case of, right?
It's still very much within use then. These are all still predicated on use prior to pricing. Okay, got it.
Yeah, prior to pricing. Yeah, but there can be different monads. We can define different endofunctors that obey, as long as they obey these two conditions. We can kind of come up with a different way of looking at this space. So this is just two examples here, but I think there could be something we could explore, because they are also deeply, they're really important for this internal language, right? The relationships between monads and internal language is something I've been interested in, but not really sure how to go with that. Yeah.
We'll see how it plays with the main topic of labor and so on. We can see if we can recuperate some ideas. Yeah,
maybe it'd be useful later.
Okay, even this part, I think we can also use it more in the context as we go, right?
Yeah. This one is actually, this is actually how we use the delta resolution in the paper. We come up with this idea of a resolution box. So if you remember from section 14, the resolution, the operad is basically like a box with wires coming in and out of it. And then the composition of boxes is such that you can put boxes inside of other boxes and connect the wires together, right? So that you use this to model a productive process in terms where you can always dive further into this process. So you can unbox it to see what's inside of a box, right? So in the case of these Amazon workers here, you have the same worker kind of, let me just imagine that they're the same worker. Of course, they're different people, but imagine it's the same worker doing different tasks in the Amazon fulfillment center. So we wanted a way to kind of model this behavior of a worker that's kind of changing their resolution, right? Unlike a material like, I don't know, a hammer, although a hammer could be used in different ways, the number of resolutions of a hammer is pretty low, right? But for a worker, labor power, you can actually adjust what the worker needs to focus on, what the worker should be doing at any given moment, right? So we came up with this idea of a resolution box, which is a box that takes labor in and returns labor out. But the labor that comes out has a different resolution than the labor that goes into it, right? So if we go back to this idea of like wood that makes pencils versus wood that makes a chair, you can see like just replace wood here with labor, right? A laborer that makes pencils might need to be called in to make chairs using a different set of skills, but it's the same person, right? You pay for their hour.
Yeah, and even within the same labor, like for example, in the resolution box in the next slide, you can imagine, for example, that this is, I don't know, cutting wood, which is something we're gonna use this example a couple of times today. Like you refine your work with the resolution box to become, let's say, wood cutting work. But once you cut some wood, you can refine it to cut it better, right? There's a sort of zeal to work, which is this sort of constant negotiation with the material. You try to cut it the first time, and this is the wood, right? And it goes okay, but not perfect. So next time you learn better and you try again and it goes a bit better. So even in the case of specific skills, the resolution box not only distinguish specializations of labor, but they can also serve to talk about further attention or further precision or specification such that the task happens, right?
Yeah, and this is kind of this is the reason we can count those two things as the same, like different sets of skills and also doing the same thing but better, has to do with how plastic the use set is in a way. Like the use set is it has extensive and intensive aspects to it, right? Like you can put a lot of different uses of labor into one set, but you can also intensify or focus a single use of labor into like more fine-grained detail, right? And that is part of use itself. Like the concept, I think we're adding something new to the concept of use here, which is that it is like a space that can be explored.
Mm-hmm.
And because it can be explored, that's where this delta box comes in. And that's also, I think, where the metaphor, again, to bring that up, the Julia set comes in, because you're kind of exploring this set of uses in ever more, let's say, finer details, right? So
I love that idea, because there is a bit of an iterational recursive thing with the delta resolution box, right?
Yeah.
And I mean, the idea,
you can plug this. Sorry, just one thing. You can plug exactly this Julia set into the box. It can be Julia set goes in, the next iteration of the Julia set comes out of the delta box.
I think the right lesson to learn from that is that even very simple operations, when you make them recursive, give you very complex dynamics. So
Yes.
like anytime that something like that is happening, we can basically assume that the dynamics is gonna have the scale relativity.
Yes.
Yeah, I think that this is a lot of this is a big part of what comes next in the presentation. The idea that, for example, right, this is the what, labor power. This is the how, right? Again, it's specialized, this form of skill, and so on. And capitalists make surplus not really because of the what, though. I mean, the what here in our case is already a logical category. It's a commodity that behaves in a specific way, which is labor power. But this how of the production, this is where you can actually extract more structure from a place where it seems like there's no structure to be extracted anymore, right? So resolution boxes become a very important part of exploring surplus value extraction, and in many forms, not only just intensifying labor or making it more precise, but we'll see also other forms. And I think that once you have this clear sense of resolution and the idea that it's connected with how you decompose an object into parts based on relevant predicates for that context, right? You can see that there is a whole theory of this decomposition and recomposition of uses that is not really something Marx clearly develops. It's constantly at play in his theory, but it's never fully fleshed out as such. And that's precisely the field where cooperation and other forms of recomposition of laborers happen, right? So I think it's where we start finding the place beyond the gravitational pull of capital. So it is a big kind of turning point for us, and also because it gives concrete meaning to that very general statement we made in the text we published in the Crisis Critique, when we said, well, utopic socialism is all about escaping capital through space, right? You move outside. So scientific socialism is escaping capital through time. You move after. And we're developing something that tries to find ways out through scale. So sometimes you move into, right, or above in a weird zooming meaning, right? And you find structures that are not priceable in that way, rather than temporally or spatially. So resolution boxes are, for now, I think the most concrete tool we developed that both explains a bit better what goes on and opens up to stuff that is a bit outside of capitalism in a new way as well.
Yeah, it reminds me of the conversation in The Wire from season 1 where they talk about the guy who invented the chicken nugget, and they're speculating on what happened to that guy. Like the guy who's invented the chicken nugget, which is a regular employee that kind of did something on the in his off time, right? That ended up becoming a new product line. But this thing was like not part of his job. So in some sense, the resolution box is like very fragile. You could do something that's not in it, but can be then caught up in the job description later on.
I think that's No, I think we'll actually go into that as well now.
Yeah, that's the next section. Okay, I can stop sharing here.
Yeah, actually, I'll need to share it because I need to use the sound, share the sound as well. We prepared something weird for the next part. So, I mean, I think that we can divide this presentation in 2 parts. Section 1, 2, and 3 are more formal. Sections 4, 5, and 6 are more conceptual and developing closer relation to Marx, but trying to apply the stuff that we just discussed. So the question is, what is the compositional approach to labor use? And what in terms of talking about labor specifically, what is this resolution space, right? And how, in which way is this a more general question than the question of measure? Because we will show that the measure of value as labor time and so on is actually a restriction of this thing we're talking about. So again, it further reinforces the idea that this is a broader perspective, as Dennis was saying, an enriched kind of embedding of the commodity category to something that can see a bit more perhaps already than you can immanently see from the perspective of commodities, right? So the first thing we have here is just a definition to make it clear. It's already an application of the method of what we call method of restrictions, but to the difference between private means of production and labor power. So what are private means of production? We distinguish private means of production from natural means, as Dennis said, because you will see that there is a condition here that natural means of production does not share. So MP, or means of production, is a commodity. It is the output of previous commodity production. It is made, therefore, of other commodities. It is used in the production, so it goes into a new productive process. And everything you need to reproduce MP is also bought and used inside production. Right? So it is a commodity. Before it, other commodities went into its making. It is therefore made of commodities. It's going to go to be part of a new commodity, and everything you need to make that commodity remain what it is, or to do what it does, for example, a motor and fuel, right? Or cleaning things you need to clean some tool or whatever. They're also bought and used up inside the production process. So this is the condition that is not in the case of natural means of production. They are commodities, but they're not made of commodities and they're not output of previous production process, right? A piece of land was not the product of labor or the product of commodity production, but it is used in production. And if you need to buy fertilizers, you also use them up in the production process, right? Labor power is different, but you see, we don't distinguish it substantially. We distinguish it in terms of the type of commodity it is with regards to other commodities. So it is a commodity that is not the output of a previous commodity. Just like natural means of production, you don't create labor through labor, right, or through commodities. It is therefore a fictive commodity, which is how Karl Polanyi calls commodities that were conformed into the commodity form rather than produced as such. Labor is used in production, but it reproduces itself outside of production. So the things you need to keep labor alive, it's fuel or it's fertilizer. The capitalist doesn't need to buy that as well, right? He pays the laborer and the laborer buys it outside of production. So you see, these are not, none of these define humans as capable of labor power. Any set that is caught up by commodity preserving relations. In this way, will be called labor power. The only other example I could find, if Bender from Futurama is paid for his labor and then buys fuel in the market, right? He's a commodity. He's no longer considered just a product. He's a responsible, separate legal entity used in production, but reproduces outside of production. You could exploit and Bender and consider him labor power. So you have a compositional distinction between means of production and labor power, in the sense that because everything that goes into MP and comes out of MP are commodities, the parts of means of production are all priced already, right? It's like saying that, it's something we discussed already a bit, this idea that there were commodities here with some cost and some value. They went into the making of MP. So everything that is part of it now actually can be assigned. There are prices to its parts, right? Whereas not all parts of labor power are priced because it is not made of commodities. So not everything in it is a commodity. And the commodities that it does need are not purchased by the capitalist. So they don't, when I use it more, like when I use the land more, I need to buy more fertilizer. So the reproduction cost grows with increasing productivity. When I increase productivity of labor, I don't need to buy more food for the laborer, because the laborer is the one who needs to go outside and buy the food himself. So there is a disjunction between how I use labor and the value of labor, right? Please interrupt me, guys, if anything is confusing. I just wanted to move a bit quicker. So to understand this idea of labor power, from a compositional point of view, to go back to that, like to specify a bit more this diagram for the case, this Venn diagram for the case of labor, we can imagine it in sort of 4 layers. Imagine there is something like the set S, that is the ontological support set of labor power, the extensional set of everything that is below labor power in some sense. If I'm a worker, is everything that I am or can be or whatever, as broad, infinite, and indistinguishable as you want to define. Then you have what we call the use set of labor, which is the very fuzzy set of every map that goes from commodities to this general set, or from the set to commodities. So just the set of these maps, right? So something goes into labor and composes with it. Something goes from it when it composes with other things. Well, the set of all commodities that are transforming together with labor in this way form this general labor use set, right? So for example, it includes labor, but includes also individual consumption. When you transform your body by eating some yogurt, you're not producing commodities, but it's composing with commodity, right? Now, we call concrete labor a restriction of this amount of possible transformations of the use set. So it's a subset of LPU, right, of the use set of labor power, that is made of parts that compose in transformative ways with means of production in a productive process. So from all those arrows going in and here, separate only those that are composing with commodities, so LPU, and that are composing with means of production in a productive process. So that would give you, for example, this orange region here, which is just a lot of transformations, right? Now you can restrict this even further and say, now single out the subset of concrete labor of all compositions with means of production, such that the output preserve the value of labor power and means of production in the product, right? So only the ways of using labor such that the value of the output of this compositional process will have at least as much value as the labor and the other stuff that went into it. So for example, if somebody gives me a bunch of paper that is worth I don't know how much, and it cost me I don't know how much to work for one day with this paper, there is just a restricted amount of ways I can for example, do origamis with the paper that will produce an output that is at least as valuable as my time plus the paper. And that's what we call abstract labor. Abstract labor is not abstracted out of use. Abstract labor is abstracted into use. It's a further restriction of the forms of use to the forms of use that preserve value. Now, value is given by the transcendental of value exchange. So it's a definition that is seen or restricted from the perspective of value, but the thing being restricted is concrete use, right? So from the many ways I can accomplish a task, some of those ways preserve value. Some other ways are sloppy and dumb. So abstract labor for us is a abstracting into the ways labor can do something, not abstracting out and considering from a larger standpoint or a zoomed out standpoint and saying everything is indifferent, everything is a product of energetic expenditure of human efforts. You don't need to have this sort of idea that abstract labor is a mental abstraction, right? It is a concrete form of differentiating labor that abstracts away from all the possible ways to keep only those that preserve some property, right? The property of value in the object, in the produced object, right?
Could you say maybe at a certain level, like when management looks at workers, are looking to kind of constrain CL to AL, and that's actually kind of like a
I think that
the way that capitalists actually look is, I think, described here.
Yeah, I think that the very important thing that you're touching on, it is an underlying topic of this discussion, because you see, once you define abstract labor in this way, the abstracting is practically accomplished. It's not mentally accomplished as an average from the perspective of exchange, right? Which is one of the interpretations that you find from Marxists. Abstracting is done in the very way things are done and shaped and so on. But there are many ways that, how do you know something is not preserving value, right? How do you measure if value is being preserved in labor? So that's where usually labor time comes in, right? You're fast, you're slow. It's already a temporal measure. But you see, it's not obvious that you would look at time to make sure that value was preserved. So we need to explain why that's one measure, but there are others, right? Sometimes, I mean, the predicates that distinguish workers in the workplace are not only temporal predicates, right? Use of labor, as Dennis was saying with the resolution idea, the uses of labor are distinguished and considered or differentiated in many ways, from being cooperative, being attentive, being disciplined, not wasting. All those things are trying to preserve value, and they're predicates that are already trying to kind of restrict the kind of free movement, not in the pretty heroic sense, but in the sense of like wasteful, noisy movement of a system, right? Into the reducing degrees of freedom to something that guarantees that value be preserved. So I agree with you that it has everything to do with that, and I think that our approach helps to develop a phenomenology of the workplace, right? That is connected, which is already much more organizational, but it's deeply connected with the problem of value in macro social analysis, like in capital. It becomes easier to make the move between the two. So yes, definitely, I would totally agree. There is an important connection there, right? And another thing I would just mention is that it's important to see that, well, if this blue thing here, right, is determining this fuzzy use set of labor, is not the same as the S set. So things that try to go here and capture parts of this and bring it here are bringing more structure, right, into a logical space. This is something we're going to look into now. So the basic thing just to remember, which is how we move from this thing I just said to surplus extraction is, so if the value of labor power, so this is the use set of labor, and I just distinguish, let's say, actions that a laborer does. They can be temporal, like it does this first, then this, or they can be predicates, like you work with this quality and this quality and this quality, I don't care. It's just the fact that you have some use set and you can look into it with in some way, right? And this way can allow you to divide that set into parts. Well, but the value of this set of labor, of uses of labor, is not determined by what you do and how you divide it. It's determined by the commodities you need to reproduce yourself, right? Which is outside of the production process. So just as it's written here, if the value of labor power is determined by the means of subsistence, then the value of parts of of labor use combined with parts of MP, right? This combination here. With this action, I will turn this thing. With this action, I will turn this thing. With this action, I will transform this thing. And then the product gathers all of this, right? So the value of parts of the use of labor can exceed the value of labor. There's already a nice kind of the sort of trickery philosophers like, because this is something, and the parts of it, the parts of this can be have more value than the thing itself. And on the other hand, why doesn't this happen with means of production? Because when I look at parts of the means of production, I already know how much they're worth because they were made of commodities. So they have, let's say, a sort of value that is carried into production, whereas the value of labor power is left outside of production. So you can actually explore it here. And then the value of the product will be the value of means of production invested, and not the value of the labor that I paid with wages, but the value of the labor that I used. So this can be higher than the sum of this and this, right? So this implies the possibility that non-priced parts of LPU become priced, right? So there are parts of labor power that have no price. I don't know how much they're worth. And I'm exploring these parts. I'm dividing the use of labor into smaller bits, actions, tasks, predicates, whatever. And I want to do it in such a way that I explore that labor beyond its own value. Well, to explore it beyond its own value means that I'm going to take a part of it that has no price and I'm going to bring it into the world of prices or the world of value. So the big issue is, how do you price labor then? How do you move from labor use to having a measure of its value? If the criteria for the magnitude of value is outside of production, how do you value these things? Right? So this thing here is Marx's famous theory of value form, right? It's 3 steps here. The particular value form, the sort of expanded value form, and the universal equivalent. And we show that we can use Badiou's logics of world to translate this into our compositional approach, right? Where you make a local equivalent to I'm not going to go into it right now just so we don't spend too much time, and we already discussed this a bit. But the fact is that I think a contribution that we made is that we realized that the same logic, once you translate this into this, you can apply the same logic to derive labor time. You can start without supposing that the use set of labors is measured or is made of time. Why is that the case? Why do you need to assume that to be the case? You don't. And you can show how to derive labor time using the same principle of how we derive money. So to recall, right, first you establish a local equivalence between commodities like this, right? You can say that they are maximally exchangeable. Then you can, for example, start looking at, okay, but let's look at all other commodities and from the standpoint of one and say, well, these two are maximally exchangeable. These are not so much. These are totally not exchangeable. They cannot be exchanged at all. So I have a list where this is equivalent to asking how much like A, right? Or A like B is. B is maximally like A. C is kind of like A. D is nothing like A, right? So you turn A into a predicate. And you're assessing how much of that predicate is in other commodities, right? But then to create a universal, to expand this universally, what you do is that once you have this, and you were comparing, like looking at commodities from the standpoint of A and seeing how much A-ness they have, you can create an atom, or you try to find a minimal predicate, what's called like an atomic predicate, that not only sees A, so A can be said to be made of little a, but the others can also be said to be made of little a, right? A as an atom that makes up parts of A as well as every other commodity. So it's not that we say C is A-like, D is A-like, B is A-like, but both A, B, C, and D are atom-like to some degree. So everything gets to be compared in terms of this atom. So at this point here, we found, let's say, a predicate that we can build up the differences between commodities from that predicate, right? But this is not enough to get to money. And in this case, it's nice to see that the fourth point in our development is clearer, in my opinion, than Marx. He goes from this dialectical development and then adds this in the next chapter in the form of a short note. Yeah, but then you need to find the formal use value because you need this basic atom to have a property. It's not enough to just be a predicate that let's say, allows you to recompose A, C, and B, but it needs to have a particular property, which is to be homomeric, right? To be able to be partitioned into smaller versions of itself while keeping the same quality. So that I can say, for example, if A is not very much like B, okay, it's B to the P degree, and I have that atom here that sees both A and B. There is a version of A, which is, let's say, smaller A, that sees a part of A, a smaller part of A, and makes that part of A maximally exchangeable with B. So just to turn it into numbers, right? You have A and B, and you say, oh, they're not maximally exchangeable. It's because this costs 100, and this costs 100. Sorry, costs less, like 70. Well, if I have money as a predicate, I can see a version of A that only costs 70, a smaller, and then these are exchangeable. So this possibility of ordering all possible values in terms of A gives you a totally ordered version. For example, when you go to 100, 70, 60, and so on, right? So this is more integrated in our case, I think, than in Marx's case. So this is the last step. To arrive at money, you need to find an atom that allows to totally order the predicates. They're not simply incomparable, but they're all comparable in some transitive way.
Yeah, I would add here that it's not necessary that an atom that is compatible with a bunch of other atoms needs to be a totally ordered measuring stick. It just happens to be that money is totally ordered and has this property.
Yeah, exactly.
But it is also possible to consider, like a measuring stick which is partially ordered and yet is compatible with a set of other measuring sticks. Yeah.
Yeah, true. You could end here, right?
Yeah.
So once you have this logic, which I presented very poorly, you can actually derive socially necessary labor time using it. You can imagine, for example, that you compare a way of one person working to another and say they work kind of like each other to the P degree. Or you can start comparing workers and say, well, C is very much like A. D is nothing like A at work. And you compare them based on one example, for example, right? You can have a model worker and say, Karen is really not like, you know, John, in the sense that John is a very good worker and Karen is not like him. And the other person is very much like John, right? So you get an expanded comparison. So B works more like A, C works less like A. And then you can find an atom, it's kind of like a W, where we are now predicating not based on the worker, but on the way of working, for example. And we can say that, well, A is maximally like this way of working, B is not so much like this way of working, D is more or less. And we call this something Marx didn't use, which is socially necessary labor use. Again, as Dennis was saying, like this can be an atom, like a predicate, a way of working that we define, that is compatible with every other thing we're looking into, right? John, Susan, Karen, and so on. Their labor use, but it's not totally ordered. We might not be able to totally order these comparisons, right? But there is one predicate that we know that is composing every work, right? And not only does it compose every work, but it also has the same property of money, that it can be divided quantitatively into totally ordered parts, which is time. With the predicate time, now I can totally compare. I can say A goes here, B goes here, C goes here, and so on. So you can use exactly the same logic that Marx uses to derive the value form and money to derive socially necessary labor time. You don't need to take it for granted that we cannot talk about it because it's from the space of use. No, you can actually construct it. And why time would be a measure? Time is a good measure because it's kind of isomorphic to the money form, right? At the same time that it offers a predicate that allows you to construct and relate to other predicates in the labor space. Does that make sense? Like, is that okay?
Yes.
Yeah, I mean, one thing here is like loss of information, right? Like from 3 to 4 in both money and the socially necessary labor time, we can talk about like the space of possible.
Yeah, this is where the delta is very operative, right?
Yeah.
We moved from ways of working, which is a very rich kind of predicate space, to taking time, faster, slower, and so on, right? In the same way that we moved from comparing every commodity in terms of how much like a cigarette it is, to simply, you know, being totally ordered, like being more or less, right?
Yeah, exactly. So there's a question of like alternate forms of compatibility there, but yeah.
The thing that I wanted to explore is that usually we start with labor time, and that's the discussion. But this thing that Dennis just said, this move here, which it has some loss of information, it could not have happened, or it could happen otherwise. It's very interesting for us. So, and also because there is a certain tension between something that could be partially ordered here, right? These values, like comparing A to B and saying it's P degree, and then to C and saying it's Q degree. This doesn't need to be ordered like a thermometer with P and Q here, right? It could be one of those posets with P here, Q here. And then they're just different. They're not more like, you cannot really include one into the other, right? So there is a movement here from the sort of poset to the totally ordered set that is interesting to pay closer attention to. And the reason why I asked you to use headphones or just to have the sound on, is because I think we found a nice way to discuss this by looking at what happened before clocks were used in production processes. So this is a really amazing book. I really suggest it. It's a pity Caron is not here. I hope he gets a chance to watch the meeting later. But this book tracks the history of how music was used at work in Britain. And they separate 5 kind of uses of songs within labor processes throughout, let's say, the last 600 years. They are not like stages. They can be kind of overlapping uses, but it's interesting, and we'll consider a particular moment of this. So the first is just work songs as a sense of community. So people are working, and then they kind of use the sounds of work just to sing over or to as musical material, right? So the rhythms and forms of work, they are included into the musical world, so to speak. You are banging against a rock, the other guy starts banging against your rhythm just so it's nice to hear, and then you sing over it. It's actually, let's say, the work song is building a sense of community and something else. But the thing that interests us is actually this point 2 here, which is we're going to look in more detail, which is that work songs were a means to make work more functional. It's the kind of inverted structure where musical structures start informing the rhythm and form of work. So you start coordinating labor and measuring labor in terms of the songs. If people cannot follow the song, if they cannot hit the hammer on the rock at the same time, you can start comparing, right? The guy who is less than average based on the rhythm of labor that the song is imposing, right? The book also explores other things. We'll actually get to some of them. But for example, they talk a lot about how music, at the same time you're measuring labor, the content of the song sometimes is resisting or imagining something else other than the discipline of labor. So it's funny to see, funny not, but it's interesting to see that sometimes the structure of the work song is made in such a way that it coordinates the function that is going on in labor, but the content of the lyrics that people are singing are pointing the other way around, right? Talking about resistance, talking about not being there, talking about having some other life. What we'll see, so this part we won't be exploring that much, but what we will see is that it's very interesting that once something happened in production in Britain, so once machines started organizing the productive rhythms, there were no work songs anymore. And work songs became songs about work, right? Not songs immanent to the workspace, right? This idea here that this quote suggests, right? That it wasn't about, they were scything the corn and singing, and somebody asked, what is the song? And the person says, it doesn't mind the song, doesn't matter the song, it's the singing that counted. That the singing counted, I think we will try to take this very seriously. The singing was really counting something, right? And the moment that you don't need the singing to count, there is this idea that the workspace went silent, and then finally it was reintroduced in the 20th century as a way to kind of diverge attention away from the conditions of labor and so on. But we won't go into much into this because I think it's more, their theory is not that interesting anyway. So I'm not gonna read this, though you guys can see the slides afterwards. I think it's very interesting how they describe. And the example that I took is from the section in the Western Islands of Scotland. There is this this process of softening cloth called walking. And they say here that singing was a vital component in the final stage of making tweed, the hand feeling, shrinking, thickening, and softening of new woven cloth for household use. And it's still going on, people still do it. And we have here an example. I'm not sure if you guys can hear it, I hope you can.
It's a very natural thing to do, I think.
Is the sound functioning?
Yeah, it works.
I just absolutely love these songs. It's real rootsy stuff.
Yeah,
They're so
this
simple
guy is
and
the
versatile
worst.
that you can pin a lot of stuff on them. And that
Yeah,
makes
but you
them
can see what they're doing, right? I'm just gonna mute it. they're singing and then they hit the cloth against the table in the rhythm of the song. And what this little clip doesn't show, but another part of this clip shows, is that they hit it against the table, then they move it like to the side, and the other person grabs in another place of the cloth, and then they continue banging, right? Here's another couple of examples of the similar sort of word songs that are part of the process. So let me stop here. You can see that this guy is clearly below average because he doesn't hit the ground in the beat. So you see, like the song induces a sort of way of measuring labor that is not yet what Marx would call labor time, with chronological time to associate with abstract time and clocks and so on. But it's actually already allowing you to see value inside of the production process. You can start seeing ways of, let's say, predicates that do capture something that allow you to compare workers in terms of what's socially necessary for them to be doing, right? I think there's another example here. Yeah, it's very similar. I think I didn't stop the video in the right place, but it's very interesting. For example, the songs are usually you sing on top, and the rhythm comes from labor itself, right? It's not somebody else playing. Though there is a stage, and in some situations that's how it happens. Like say in sea shanties in ships, the ropes don't make noise. So either you have a separate person who plays something to mark the durations, right? Or the singing is more syncopated, such a way that you can hear not syncopated, it's more mark the pulsation so that you can hear it. And the field of study around this is so interesting and unfortunately very underdeveloped in some points, because there is not much written on the correlation between musical structure and forms of labor. So I looked into this, and I only found a couple of YouTube videos, in fact, and not really anthropological or sociological texts, connecting the fact that this musical structure of sea shanties is such that the last line, the last syllable of a line is connected with the first in the same pulse. Like the last line is connected with the next stanza or something like this. There, you skip a beat. And if you look at the work at sea that they were doing, you need to, like when I stop pulling the rope, you need to be picking it up before, let's say, I finish doing it. So the overlapping of the verses in the song, and not only the verses, but the melodic structure and the pulses, that shorten the pulse in a way, like you skip a beat at the end, reproduces something that you need to do in the workplace, right? So it helps to give form to the structure in a socialized way. I just added here two, but I'm not even going to play them. It's just two songs where you can see that they're singing against labor. So these guys are pulling this thing, but they're singing a song that has nothing to do with the activity itself. On the contrary, it even leads them to dance and move and talk in a way that you can see it has a different function, closer to what they call here this resistance to labor or whatever, but I don't want to go into that. I wanted actually to explore a bit more this idea of the song structure and explorations of labor use. Like this is the actual lyric for this song here. I just wanted to pay attention to another detail, which is that first, let's hope it opens. Could you please play? Sorry. Then again. And then again, one person. And then again, everyone. So I just added this. These are sung by one person, and then after every call, like what's called, right? You would call this like a call. You have this answer or response that everyone does, right? So you set up with a call, and then everyone responds. And then again, you set up the call, and everyone responds, right? So it's interesting to consider this sort of work song as a possible atom of labor use, because first it offers, like, the steady pulse of the song corresponds to physical activity, right? So in the case that we saw here, which is actually
It's a very natural thing to do, I think.
There is an activity that goes together, a labor activity that goes with the pulse, right? The call and response structure connects workers. So there is a call that establishes the pulse, then everyone needs to repeat the pulse, right? And as they sing, and scans, like make the scansion of their active actions fit to the pulse established by the call, right? It's interesting that you have a weird form of organizing that time so that it's not so subjective. Like a lot of things, a lot of anthropologists and people discussing these work songs, they mention that they have a lot of what they call empty vocables. I don't know how to say this in English. Like words that are just oh and yoo-hoo and things that don't really add up meaning, but they just help to make the subdivision steady. So when you sing everything, you need all the parts of between the pulses to be subdivided in the same way, even if the lyric doesn't fill it up properly. So you have a shorter sentence, but you add some other vocalizations just to make it complete, right? So it's like you want to be able to divide not only the pulse, but between the pulses as well. That's what I call a weak homomerism, that this is a quantity, and if you divide it into a smaller part, this is also a quantity, right? But it's weak because it has a very loose threshold, a very, it breaks off very easily, right? And it's also linear. It establishes some linear measure because it's kind of seen to be in poor taste to repeat songs. If you sing one, then you need to sing a new one, and then a new one, you cannot go back. So you can actually get a sort of measure of all the work songs that fitted into that work day, right? So I made a little idea here on how to think about this. So imagine this is the process that they're doing there in that video. So the cloth comes in, it goes through, let's say you hit the cloth, you pick it up, then you hit it against the table, then you move it to the next person, and then you repeat it, right? And then the soft cloth comes at the end. And you can have, for example, or to make it simpler, let's say that this is the whole process, okay? This is picking it up, hitting it and moving it to the next, who picks it up, hits it and moves it, then picks it up, hits it and moves it, and then the cloth is softened, right, after n cycles. The song, which has that structure of call, then response, then call, then response, with a strict duration, the moment that everyone is singing the song, the way of working is synced up. So now the moving and the connection between each worker is more concrete, right? So the idea is that this walking song indexes parts of each worker's activity to a common metric that first allows them to sync their activities in a more effective way, measures the length of the work journey in terms of songs, right? It's not simply in terms of the day, for example, and allows you to assess the quality of the workers based on who is lagging behind, who is going too fast, right? So it is, I think it's a good example of how the fine-tuning of resolutions from a broad version of use to a more restricted version of use, right, is the way you approach labor time as a measure. But there is a sort of space that you need to explore there. It's not guaranteed. So I did this as an alternative way to present this. So you have the cloth, right? And one worker picks it up, hits it, and moves it. So we're expanding each of those boxes, right? Then they move to a second worker who picks it up, P, right? Hits it against the table and moves it. So imagine that we have this set of a worker, of the U set of a worker, and it's composed of parts of picking up, hitting, and moving for each cycle. So the first cycle, you pick up, hit, and move. Then second cycle, pick up, hit, and move, and so on, right? So this is what you're doing here. In T1, for example, this resolution is turning this into this P1 here. Then at time 2, this resolution box is turning the same labor into H1, sorry, right? And then at time 3 is turning it into M1. Now, imagine that we add to this worker, to this labor use set, rather than the worker set, we have the singing worker with P line, H line, and M line. So you're not only picking it up, but singing the part S1 of the song. You're not only hitting, but singing S2 of the song. Not only moving, but singing S3 and so on and so forth, right? So even though this is still picking up, hitting, and moving, you're adding an action. And those actions, singing, they correspond to the response and call and response and call and response structure of the song, which is divided in more constant durations, right? So if we now go back and we imagine that every one of these activities has a part of it, which is now this S part, which is not only picking up, but I'm also singing while I do it, right? What you get is that the resolution changed. It includes the singing. So I pick it up and sing 1. Then I hit it, but sing 2. I move it, but I sing 3. Well, when I was picking it up and singing 1, someone else was moving at the time of S1 as well, of that first moment of the song. So my picking up will sync with their moving more smoothly. When I hit it against the table, I was singing S2. They were also singing S2, so they hit it together with me. So the sound is like in unison. And when I sang S3, they were also singing S3. So when I move it, it's the same time as which they're picking. So it's in sync again. So the song helps to make this sync together. I think we could make, is this clear? Just to make sure. I mean, this is totally crazy. So just to make sure it's okay. I know Dennis already, even Dennis gave up today.
I think
I think that makes sense.
Yeah. And also it brings up an interesting question, kind of going back to Pedro's talk last week, because you said, like, you know, the song isn't as, you can't fine tune homomerically a song the way you can with money resolution. But kind of like with questions of algorithms, what about like the freedom to decide, or the space of creativity to decide, okay, we want to suspend how homomeric this is because we actually prefer to create a workspace that we organize by song. And it's still like legitimate. You can still formally model work to it, but it's like, I don't know, it's just interesting because it opens up the space. There are basically like less apt ways to divide labor time that might be better for the workers themselves, if that makes sense.
Yeah, there is this work song project that does exactly that. They want to create recordings of songs in action and explain how songs work so that you can also create songs to better your work. So they do this sort of thing. The thing is that homomerism is not an enemy, right? Totally ordered in value is closely connected with facilitating the consistency of a large space of value relations, right? If we couldn't project relations between commodities into relations between parts of one commodity, which is money, we wouldn't have a measuring stick that is functional everywhere we go. So I mean, just not to make it seem like this is a beautiful, rich thing, and then money is a terrible, reducing thing. That's part of the problem at hand, right? This is also very local. The song, once the song ends, it's over. If people sing slow, the guy who makes the call is in a bad mood. You measure everything differently. So it's locally very interesting. And I think it's, in my opinion, it's an interesting critique of some things that Moishe Postone presents in this book, which is a great book about the relation between time, labor, and capital. But he talks about abstraction of time as a sort of, as if there weren't really steps between the workday as this sort of large duration between, you know, morning and night, and people couldn't measure what happened inside. And then the clock was brought in, and abstract time divided this into parts. But even before clocks were around, you could already start seeing people dividing in a sort of proto-chronological way, a non-subjective pulsation of work. That's not privilege of the abstract time of mechanical clocks to have introduced that. Even though, of course, his whole point is that mechanical clocks were not introduced because they existed, but the reason for them to be introduced is because production was already structured in that way, in some sense, right? So he talks about how China bought a bunch of mechanical clocks from Europe and didn't use them for production, because the logic of production wasn't to measure up every little bit of value from labor. So why would you want to measure labor in terms of time, of chronological time? So you need to have social relations already in place for clocks to be, let's say, objectifying those relations in a specific way, right? And we can do exactly this, talk about the clocks. What will clocks be doing? Rather than having the song structure, which is very loose, it has parts, it has segments, it has a pulse, it has some social connection that objectifies it, but it can have slightly different pulses, it ends very quickly, it still is, let's say, valid only for those who are singing or hearing it, right? And with a clock, right, with a temporalized worker like this, with a clock you have some function, some mechanical recursive function that given one instant you have the next and the next and the next and the next. It's very strongly infinitely divisible, right? So you start being able to assign to P some instance, and to hitting some instance, and to moving some instance. And you can say if it's too fast or too slow with regards to it, right? And unlike singing, to sing is to add something to, let's say, I was going to pick something up, but I sing it as well. I sing the first beat, right? But with regards to time, I don't need to add time here, right? In a certain sense, time was already part of what I was doing. It takes some time, right? So in that sense, since every action takes some time, it is already an atomic predicate of every action. You could already describe it in those terms. It is more objective than the song. It's already shared by all workers. It could not be shared, right? They're absolutely homomeric and not just kind of subdivision wise, right? You have 1, 2 bits and then you divide them into smaller subdivisions. And it's totally independent from any cycle. It doesn't require you to restart it or anything like this, right? So you could just imagine that you add this sort of machinery. And I just added this here because if the clock is kind of like adding a bit of a motor or sort of energetic thing, right, that will give you through some transmission system some effect, which is steady tick-tock, right? The way that Marx describes the industry as a system of machinery and machines as being generally of the form of a motor, a system of transmission of energy and a system of tools, it's like you turn the factory itself into a big clock. So that's why I just added this to remind you. But ultimately, you get to index resolutions on time and sync activities in this way, right? But you can already understand it as a development on top of what work songs were doing. Does that make sense?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
I was just saying this, the thing we said earlier about step 3 to step 4, it seems to occupy that space, right? From the compatible predicate to totally ordered predicate.
Mm-hmm.
Every work process can have its own song in some sense. So that's one compatible predicate, but then kind of at the loss of information, if you're willing to give up information, you can then map all these different songs onto one exactly. Totally ordered measuring stick.
Yeah, like all songs take some measure of chronological time, right? It's 2 minutes long, it's 3 minutes long, it's 5 minutes long. So all of them can be mapped onto chronological time, right?
Yeah, you lose the time signature, I guess, right?
Yeah, you lose something, but you gain that totally ordering, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, but we want, I mean, I think that what we want is to continue to explore what's happening inside, because just because the clock is added as a possible measuring step for labor time, which allows us to say who's lagging behind, who is not, on a certain productivity rate in the production cycle. We want to understand how this affects labor, because do you see, like, when I added S here, I have to change labor to do it, right? And this changed the resolution, right? The way of working. You work as you sing. Singing becomes part of the work set, right? And in this case, you remove the singing, but something happens when work is timed, right? An activity is duration of an activity. That's not really the same. So it's not enough to simply say, yes, we move to abstract time, we're outside of production now. Now we get to what John was saying about managers and workspace and so on, because the question is, what is a temporal constraint on labor use for real, right? What is it doing? How does it decompose labor in a particular way rather than another, right? So for example, just to go back, this is the classic issue, right? You have labor use, you know, it's the value of labor. It has nothing to do with this. It has to do with the set of consumables you need. So its value is determined. You index activities on time, on hours, for example. And then you say, well, 3 hours are needed to produce equivalent to LPMS. So we call it the equivalent labor time. Everything else you produce is surplus labor time. It's beyond the value of your own workforce. So you found a way to divide the work day and say, well, for this long, the guy was producing something that is equivalent to his own value. And from this day, the rest of the day on, he was producing something that is a surplus. So now you have a measure for how much surplus you're extracting. And I think that this is also important. Like, surplus value is not really only a problem of making people create surplus. Everything is in surplus most of the time. The problem is capturing it in the value form, right? Giving it the form of value, making it compatible with money and value, giving it the priceable form, right? So for example, my idea is let's continue exploring, not really settling for calling this then hours, but knowing that hours is a resolution that is being induced on labor use. It's being considered by the hour, or in a temporal way or in a durational sense, right? But it's still the use set that we're interested in. So I thought of this example here to start talking about actions and this sort of use space of labor. So it's very stupid. Imagine that we're gonna chop some wood and attach the pieces. So you need wood, an axe, some nails, and a hammer, and some amount of work. We don't know how many workers, right? But to compose wood with using the axe, right, to chop the wood, you will get the axe, hold the wood, and then hit the wood. This will divide it into 2 pieces. Then using the nails and the hammer, which you pick up the pieces, get the hammer, get the nails, hold the pieces, position the nails, and hit the nails. I'm just calling it 1 and 2 here because there are 2 steps, right? But I'm not saying how many people are doing it. So one worker could do both of them. Imagine there's a delta resolution here, 1 labor power. First, I go and I get the axe, hold the wood, and hit the wood. Then there's another resolution in which perhaps with more care and I need to approach it differently. I'm picking up the pieces and they're no longer, I don't no longer see them as like a raw matter. I see them as pre-processed, something I need to be careful. I need to preserve the form in which I cut them. Something is different, right? It's a different resolution of labor. I get the materials, I hold the pieces with care, and now I hit the nail. Right, so it really can be a different resolution. Holding the pieces here can be very different than holding the wood here. Something like this, right? So if we think about these actions from 1 to 9, we could organize them a bit like this. Like these 2 need to happen before this. This needs to happen before this. These 2 can happen at any time as long as they are before this one, right? And then this one is only needed when this thing happens. So it's not really totally ordered, right? I don't need to get the axe, then hold the wood, then hit the wood, and pick up the pieces, and get the hammer. There is some tree-like structure. You can still do things simultaneously or totally ordered, like one after the other. You still can choose, right? So for example, imagine the first situation where I'm employing 2 laborers, LP1 and LP2, right? And LP1 will do actions 1 to 3. That's, let's say, the resolution of LP1. And LP2 is doing 4 to 9, right? So LP1 will get the axe, hold the wood by himself, then hit the wood, and then pass on to LP2, who picks up the pieces, gets the hammer, gets the nails, holds the pieces, positions, blah, blah, and hits the nail, right? It becomes totally ordered because one person's labor use set is indexed on time. So they can only do one thing after the other. Right? So I'm actually mapping this to something that is totally ordered like this. But I could, I could also, for example, have 4 workers. Let's say LP1 does actions 1 and 3. He gets the axe and hits the wood. When he goes to hit the wood, somebody's already holding it, right? LP2 does just that. He only holds the wood. He holds the wood, somebody hits it, he grabs another one, holds it again, and that's just it, right? LP3 does 4 and 7. He picks up the pieces and holds the pieces together for LP4 to get hammer, get nails, position the nail, and hit it. In this case, we no longer need to totally order it in that way, right? You kind of preserve this structure, but you find just this sort of minimal direct connections like this, right? So this is one, this is another, this is another, if I'm not mistaken, and this is another, right? These 2 are ordered. So you kind of cover this partially ordered structure of labor with smaller, totally ordered sets of actions. I can still time this thing, right? Time this thing, time this, and time this. But the total process is not fully ordered in like a serial line. So what is interesting about this is that this stupid example already shows that it's not really surplus extraction, increasing productivity. It's not about timing workers and that's it. It's a correlation or a mixture of covering space, covering labor use with time measures, and finding the most effective structure to make this most imbricated together, right? Most connected in its parts.
That's a question real quick.
Yeah.
So when you articulate this now over 4 different areas, does that mean that there are now 4 resolution boxes?
Yeah.
And each one of those workers are now looking at it from 4 as opposed to the diagram 3 ago where you had 2 resolution boxes in the original operad, or are those?
Yeah, like here, right? Yeah, it would be like you have LP1 going here together with LP2, each one with a different resolution, right? And then LP3 and LP4 going here.
Okay. So if you went the other way then, and like if I was doing all that by myself, there would be 1 resolution box for the whole process.
No, it would be 1 LP with 1 resolution here. Actually, perhaps with many, right? Like this. I don't know. Then LP here with another resolution, right? 1 LP with many resolutions depending on the part of the process.
I guess that's a question then for me, because let's say I'm doing that process and I'm like in the original, go back to the operad for a second, because that's the main thing I'm thinking of. Like if I'm approaching that and that's all my work, right? And assuming I have a certain amount of say in how I arrange things, I would want to arrange it as much as possible to make it a single process for me, however I break it up. And so it would be a single set of processes from beginning to end, which would make it a resolution box for me.
Yeah, I mean, remember, operads allow you can write it like this.
Mm-hmm.
The same thing as is above here. Imagine you just cut this like this and close it. And
Okay.
Yeah, you can always just, you can open the box further, right? What you just said is like, imagine that the appropriate description is at this level here. And close this description here. I don't want to look inside.
Okay, yeah. So
right?
we have the freedom to do that in this.
Yeah, this thing is fine with that. And I mean, we could call it that create a sort of range, right, of resolutions. You're going to be looking at wood and at axes and hammers in a certain way. So some set of properties are relevant, and those are all the relevant properties for all the process, right? But if you're, for example, in a more Taylorist perspective, the guy who actually sets up the process, he's looking at it with an open box and timing each part of these 9 activities in terms of their different temporal moments, right? And measuring you in terms of if you're following those times or not, and he's going to fire you if you just do it your way.
Yeah.
Right.
Okay,
so you could think of it in terms of 1 resolution box, but perhaps the most intelligible, the richer description is not that one for a Taylorist process.
Mm-hmm.
But you can say, like, if you ask the guy, what do? He will say, I'll go to the factory, I chop some wood, and I leave at the end of the day. He won't say, I go there and I get the axe, I hold the wood, I hit the wood. But the Taylorist manager, he might. My workers come here, they get the axe, they hold the wood, they hit the wood, because the pieces, right?
Well, yeah, see, I guess that was the interest, is like, I guess at what level the resolution box is being determined, because you can determine a resolution box even if you're not the person carrying out the labor determined by that box, right?
No, yeah, the box is not a function of the laborer necessarily. It's a function of the process, right? I mean, especially in abstract labor and socially necessary labor time, if you're a lazy worker, if you're a creative type or whatever, it doesn't matter. That's not going to be captured or seen by value. That's not a difference that makes a difference. Whereas lagging behind makes a difference. Mm-hmm. Right? I think that's always the trick. Like, resolutions are not about how you see things. It's about which way of seeing captures what makes a difference.
Okay.
Right? The reason why I wanted to show this version here, where you have this sort of common parts, right? Like here and here, is because it's nice to make a distinction. And I honestly think we're treading new path here, which is the fact that Marx defines surplus in terms of individual labor. I mean, of course, the concept that matters is actually total social surplus. And that's the thing that is divided socially through profit rates. And you can only see surplus value in terms of its social aggregate and not individually in the production process. So it's not really about individual laborers. But even though it's invisible locally, its genetic theory is of the individual laborer, like I presented before, like this. You worked some hours and those was necessary, and then you worked more and that was a surplus, right? So surplus is a function of the exploitation of workers beyond their value, right? But when we start looking into labor use, we see that it's not always true that the set of actions of a worker has value when you don't consider it together with another worker, right? So when I look at the use set of a laborer, it might be composed of actions 1, 3, 7, 8, and 10. I don't know. I just made up, right? Made at time t1, time t2, whatever. But if you look at it, you don't see how value could come up from doing those things unless you remember some other worker was doing action 2 after you did 1 or together with it, then 4, 5, 6, and 9. Right? I thought of a so the idea here is imagining that even though in a certain sense capital only buys labor individually, right? And this use, and is interested in measuring it in terms of hours and measuring the point below which you're producing surplus. And then, for example, establishing the average for every worker between EQ and LPS, like this, right? Which is a measure of exploitation. Even though that's how capital sees, or how value sees labor power as these units that can be exploited beyond their limits. The labor process doesn't see laborers like this. It sees these use sets with parts, and then it's interested in the set made up of the composition of these parts together. Right? And this set here is not the same as just the combination of these two. So this is what I'm calling the collective surplus labor. It's not really a function of the individual laborers, but it's something like, it's not simply the definition of the parts of labor can have more value than the set of that part, of those parts. It's the idea that there is some weird set made of the parts of labor. And this set is not the same as the set that has these two laborers inside. It's something else. So just to give a bit of an idea of what we're talking about, imagine something like this, okay? This is, I forget now, oh my God. This is a very classic preludium by Bach. I remember I got this idea just because I have this problem. I'm a terrible piano player, and my biggest problem is that I cannot get beyond the fact that I have two separate hands, and I feel like this should structure music into two parts, like one thing that I play with one hand and the thing that I play with the other hand. But for example, when you try to play something like this, if you look at the very basic musical structure, very basically you have at first, right, something being played with your right hand, the blue part here, and another part, the bass part, being played with your left hand, right? And when you get to this part here, they invert. And this musical structure goes to your left hand, and the other musical structure goes to your right hand. They invert, right? not only this, but there is a constant musical call and response between something you're doing with one part of your right hand and something you're doing with some fingers on your left hand. So the musical structure doesn't really map out onto your left hand and your right hand, right? So if you imagine, let's say the pianist playing here, with your left hand, you're playing this at T1, you're playing this at T2, right? T3, T4, T5, the same with your right hand. But the musical structure, the richness of information cannot be seen, or it's not intelligible if you just do this and separate. And imagine that this is, let's say, the bass line and this is the melody, or this is the harmony and this is the melody. You can only see the musical structure if you mix these two stuff together, right? What happened in T1 and T2 for the left hand and what happened at T3, T4 for the right hand, and vice versa. This is a consistent music structure. This is a consistent musical structure, plus the one that is constantly connecting the two. So there is something about the set that is only counting what is relevant, the differences that make a difference, that doesn't respect the difference between left and right hand. I'm not sure if any of you play piano, but this always, especially with counterpoint, I find this amazing, that you can clearly see that there is no part of you that is playing the part of the music that you're playing. You know what I mean? Like, there's something about the combination of what I'm doing with my left hand, which is indexable in time in some way. I'm playing this note and that note, and then with the right hand, I'm playing this note and that note. But parts of these two things composed together make a structure. But it's neither one nor the other, or especially with counterpoint with many melodies, and suddenly you find harmonic intervals appearing in a structure that is something that is not any of the parts that you're consciously trying to play. Okay, I'm not sure if that made any sense.
Yeah, it reminds me of something that I've heard before, that of one way of describing, I guess, music as an art where time is the medium. And I think it kind of reminded me of that, just because that's like the one way you can like actually order music consistently in the way that you were talking about. Just an interesting connection.
Yeah, no, I think it has everything to do with it. And I mean, I remembered Bach here, especially because you start having structures of call and response that are not divisible in terms of parts, right? So for example, I mean, more orchestral music, you'll have, let's say, some line is being played here by an instrument one, instrument two is playing another line, one, and instrument two is playing another line. But let's say this is the call to this, to something that is responded here, right? And then there is a response here, or part of a melody starts here, and then this instrument continues, and this is the musical structure, right? If you look at it in terms of individual players, you don't see the musical structure. Like, it makes no sense to say, I love the melody that the violin was playing. Like, no, the violin started part of the melody, it continued in somebody else's work, or it was only half of the melodies being played here. You only hear total harmony if you consider what the other guy was doing, and this combined thing is the actual musical structure, right? So there is a mismatch between individual labor powers use sets and the collective labor use. And I think that this, I mean, we didn't really add many Marxist quotes today, and this, I think, it's the one to have. At the end of the chapter on cooperation, he says this. I'll just mention two parts here, which I think are good. So the combined workday produces, relatively to an equal sum of isolated working days, a greater quantity of use values, and consequently diminishes the labor time necessary for the production of a given useful object. Whether the combined working day in a given case acquires this increased productive power because, and then you have a long list of ways in which combination of use can change production, heightens mechanical force of labor, extends the sphere of action over greater space, contracts the field of production relatively to the scale of production, sets large masses of labor to work, excites emulation between individuals and raises their animal spirits, impresses on similar operations carried out by a number of men the stamp of continuity and many-sidedness, performs simultaneously different operations, economizes means of production by using common, lends to the individual labor the character of average social labor. Whichever of these is the cause, the special productive power of the combined workday is under all circumstances the social productive power of labor or the productive power of social labor, meaning it's not the productive power of individual labor counted together as an average, right? This power is due to cooperation itself. When the labor cooperates systematically with others, he strips off the feathers of his individuality and develops the capabilities of the species. In the same way, I would say that when you're playing together with a large ensemble, it's not the case that, and this is the crucial part, which I'll return to in a bit, it's not the case that you have like a bunch of units and then you sum them up together. But is that from the perspective of the total musical structure, you're playing a part of it, and this other guy's playing a part of it, and this other guy's playing a part of it, and you might be playing this part and then this part. They interact on your point, but the decomposition of this totality doesn't necessarily preserve your individuality. You see the point? Like once you have the perspective of common labor use, the sort of composition of many labor uses, the building blocks from which you arrived at this total picture allow you to decompose the total picture in something other than the original building blocks. So for example, I come into the orchestral rehearsal as a violin player, but when I'm playing, I'm actually just the support of a melody line, then some other harmonic structure, then something else. It's not useful and it's not adding intelligibility to distinguish the orchestra in terms of individual players anymore. Not even in terms of common instruments sometimes, right? So I think that this is the truly important part, which is this idea that this adds up to this, but when I divide this into parts, I decompose it into new parts, which are not necessarily the original ones. Whereas, how does capital do this usually? It takes laborers, it puts them to produce and add some value. If this set is larger, right, this thing here, it's just referred back as individual surplus rates. So you project this collective cooperative dimension back onto its effect, which is to increase productivity, make you work longer times for free and it takes less time to pay up your value, right? So just to complete, he says, so when the capitalist does this and he buys a bunch of labor power, he pays them the value of, let's say, 100 independent labor powers, but he does not pay for the combined labor power of the 100. So you see, combined labor power of the 100 is an added thing. And this cooperation only begins in the labor process when they have ceased to belong to themselves. So it's not something that we have, right? We enter isolated into the production process as separate private property owners who own their own labor. It's under capital rule, we are incorporated into capital, that we exist as cooperators, as members of a working organism. They are but special modes of existence of capital. Again, once you enter into cooperation, that individual distinction between workers is no longer the best distinction, the best resolution. And workers are divided into tasks, divided into moments, divided into other things, right? And the power that comes from that finer resolution through which you're seeing use, right? The productive power developed by the laborer when working in cooperation is the productive power of capital, because it's capital that creates the situation for this to happen. So this power is developed gratuitously. It's not that it's unpaid labor in the sense of parts of your use capacity that you brought in and I didn't pay for it. It's actually something that was emerged there, right? It's developed gratuitously whenever workmen are placed under given conditions, and it's capital that places them under such conditions, right? So the idea here is that labor time is a measure of value induced on parts of individual labor power, right? Parts that can be divided between equivalent and surplus labor time. But surplus labor use can rely on the composition of parts of individual labors, forming a set, actually it should be here, right? A set of collective work, of subsets of LPU, that is not equivalent to the sum of individual labor use sets. In these cases, total surplus labor time, the amount of hours that were worked for free and which can be treated as an average per worker, should be treated as an indirect measure of an exploration, right? Not exploitation merely, but kind of a laboratory, right? Of the total labor use set by used in productive processes. So in our case, in our grammar, the way we've developed this far, the exploration and combination of resolutions of labor and their indexing of value should be taken as two separate processes. The exploration of use resolutions that allow for surplus labor use, and the mapping of this surplus onto priceable parts that can be measured by value in a totally ordered way. Right? So for example, organizing work in this tree-like way is exploring resolutions of labor, combinations of resolutions, right? Covering it up with labor time in this way is turning it back onto wages and making it into priceable parts and making it so that I can count how many hours I put you to work that I didn't have to pay you for. Right? So what I propose to do, but I think I'll skip it and I'll leave it to another time, since I don't think we have that much time, is that you remember we started today already doing something cool by showing that Marx's derivation of the value of money form is applicable to socially necessary labor time, right? With these different steps that give more and more concrete, like you find a concrete atom, a localized atomic predicate that allows you to objectively recompose the relations between all those parts, right? The idea is that we can do the same for the triad cooperation, manufacture, and machine and industrial objective cooperation. I'm not going to go through Marx's quotes here, but you can just think of it in terms of at immediate accidental cooperation, for example, when we're singing songs and so on, only laborers are concrete objects, right? But their relations are not concretely established. Like this total collective surplus that comes through cooperation has no visible existence, right? You can only assess collective work in terms of assessing the difference between workers, right? When we move to manufacture, the collective worker still has no concrete existence in the sense that you don't get to see cooperation as an object, right? But it's from the standpoint of this cooperative intermixing of uses that the parts of the process are being decomposed. So you don't really see, like in subjective cooperation, when I ask who cooperates, you would say laborers cooperate. They are the units, right? In manufacture, when you say what cooperates, the answer is not workers, but actions, skilled actions, right? So for example, this is the case for cooperation where everyone is gathering wood, holding it and chopping, and as we sing, we start doing it in unison and we all get better at it, right? But when you're in manufacture, it's not like that. You divide workers by skills, one just gathers wood, one just holds wood, one just chops wood. The very skills themselves relate in a cooperative way, even though workers remain, let's say, private individuals. I just go to work to gather wood. I just go to work to hold the wood in place. I just go to work to chop wood. But gathering, holding, and chopping has some internal connection, right? But you no longer would say that the worker is the unit of this thing, right? You entered, as Mark says, the production process as individual labor use. This is connected. The parts of this are connected in some way, and then you exist there you decompose this process in accordance to its inner structure. And what we actually get is not workers, but actions. Action 1 comes before action 2, comes before action 3, and that's the structured part. You exist as what Marx would call a detailed worker, right? Somebody who doesn't see the whole process, but only a part of it. So the structure of manufacture is that of a total work process, and each laborer becomes a detailed worker predicated by the specific task one accomplishes. It is the collective worker that is decomposed into these parts, which are therefore connected regardless of the individual laborers that accomplish it. It's a formal decomposition into the collaborating parts. I find this very profound, this idea that the manufacturing productive process, which has serial and parallel combination of works that cuts off corners by creating people who only do specific tasks. What you see of labor, right? The differences that make a difference of labor use inside that process are not the labor use set as a whole, or as a complete task, or as a complete labor process, right? Of a worker working. You actually see only skilled actions chained together by the process itself, and the worker is, let's say, attached to a skill, right? Attached to a particular moment of it.
Yeah, just to jump in, I think we have, in a formal sense, already the tools needed for this objective cooperation in the form of a sheaf over the cycle times, right? Because we talked briefly about that. Actually, I don't know if we mentioned it to the group, but in the latest version of the text, we have this idea of like the overall production time can be considered like the total space of a topological space, and you can kind of decompose that into smaller cycles.
Oh yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and if you assign skills or actions, which are basically like elements of a use set, I guess, if you assign those to the cycles, you can get a sheaf. And then since commodities are sheaves, I mean, collective, it's not a big stretch to say that collective worker is also like kind of a synthetic commodity almost.
Yeah.
Would you say then the sheaf is basically like that tree that Gabriel drew before of like the productive process of what is required to do before everything else, along with for each step how many like labor hours it takes, yeah? On average, yeah,
exactly.
And then
it's
like the sheaf would be basically like over that would be like how the productive process like consistently or something like that.
Yeah, different ways of gluing the workers. So like in this case here of like you could have
gluing the tree into the productive process.
Yeah, gluing the tree into the productive process. Yeah.
Yeah, that's very interesting.
And the whole left hand, right hand thing with the Bach is very nice because it's like almost like a Mobius twist, right? Like you can have like non-trivial gluing happening in the larger sense of
if workers are like, I guess, changing their task in ways.
I mean, we'd have to probably expand because like, you know, the capitalist doesn't care about like something like that probably, but maybe in a larger space of cooperation, maybe that those kind of topological things matter more.
Just to conclude here, just so we can go back to that discussion, because I think there's something really interesting there. Like, I think that this gets further objectified, right? So we, at the first level, we had like workers. There is something that they are all part of, like their actions is all part of in a weird connected way, but this has no existence. You only see the workers, right? Then this gains some existence because it establishes a new way of dividing the workers. Even though as such, it still has no existence, right? But the third step is that this gains existence. How? By becoming the relation between parts of machines. So rather than having one guy that chops wood, another guy who, one holds the wood, picks the wood, chops the wood, whatever, you have a machine that picks up wood, holds wood, and chops wood, right? And the connection between these things itself and the thing treated as a totality is itself part of the production process now. So cooperation gets objectivated in the means of production, and workers become appendages to a cooperative object that they don't participate in, right? So something like the relation between parts of the collective worker is itself made concrete in the form of connections internal to systems of machines in a factory, objectively connecting parts of the production process in terms of priceable parts of means of production, right? We can price each part of the machine, the value of each cycle. So everything gets, there is something about cooperation that becomes now priceable because it's no longer a function of workers and labor use, but of past labor in the machine, right? Labor congealed in the machine parts. So
Yeah,
workers,
it's interesting.
see my point?
Oh,
right?
yeah, like it's like a gradual kind of ossification or kind
Yes.
of transformation of this living cooperation into kind of functional parts that are paid for. Yeah.
And there is a sense in which the sort of excess between parts and whole, right? The whole is bigger than the sum of the parts, becomes compressed because the machine is exactly the size of the sum of its parts, right? So there is no excess being lost there. And some things are interesting. For example, this structure, which is how Marx describes the basic machine structure, it's as if labor time fell inside the process, because machine parts now have an inner rhythm. They set up the rhythm of labor, right? Because they need to be moved in some ways, and they're enchained in accordance to some temporal units and so on. So the thing that was at first subjective, labor time or temporal measures of labor use, becomes collectivized with work songs, becomes objectified but still kind of independent through clocks, becomes kind of the form of the work process in manufacture, because parts of it are now connected in specific ways, and then become objectivized in the rhythm of the machine itself, which the worker is falling behind, right? And if you had that idea of average social labor time, which was an abstract idea, like an average of how we should work, once you're just an appendage to a machine, you're concretely abstracted. Like, what is the relevant resolution of a laborer who's controlling a machine doesn't change with changes to the machine. You are operating a machine that makes shoes. Next day, the company changes, and now it's making, I don't know, umbrellas, and you can operate that machine. So the relevant resolution moves to this one, and no longer this one, right? So I think that there is something to this process that is a bit like the cooperation as a particular assessment of, our place as a part in a totality bigger than ourselves. You can only assess this by looking at who cooperates with whom and totally accidental. A sort of formal expansion of this, because cooperation gets embedded in the form of manufacture, but it's not really embedded in any object, right? But it's a sort of form that you compare everyone, because that process is in itself collaborative, and then becomes concrete, like money being an object that is made of homomeric parts, right? The machine system is an object made of collaborating parts, right? And I think that this is why I said that I think that the presentation from last week vibes with ours, because this is no wonder that automation and machinery gives such a has such a seductive power, because it's almost as if you get to see this cooperative structure happening, like appearing inside the world, right? With the only caveat that you're excluded out of it, but some people might see that not as a big problem. But I think that this is underdeveloped, but I think it's nice to see that the same idea behind our treatment of the money form, which we already applied to social necessary labor time, kind of survives, but in an expanded way where you don't get to totally order anything, because a system of machines is still like a tree, right? You can have a partially ordered structure with many machines working simultaneously and so on. But that does have enough transitivity between its parts and connection of actions to serve as a sort of objective measure to cooperation in a modern workspace. And to skip, I'll just skip this because this is so cool. I didn't want to talk about it very quickly. It's just a struggle between two groups that were trying to define how would people treat Taylorism in Soviet Russia. And one was the Central Labor Institute, headed by Alexei Gastev, and the other is the League of Time, headed by Platon Kerchentsev, who was the Bogdanov group.
That's an amazing name, the Time League.
What I mean, how can we not be in the Time League? That's my question.
Yeah.
And it's very interesting the way that both groups were debating how to talk about Taylorism and how to absorb it, because in both cases you can see that what they realize is that there is something about the capitalist production process that allows for this. The fact that individuals usually get split up into individual parts, right? Like this blue little parts here are parts of me, and I can compose it back into the individual. But the productive process in the modern industry, it first embeds you into this collective thing, and then it splits you in terms of the collective set, right? And into parts that don't respect your individuality. And they praise this, right? They praise the fact that you can be decomposed into parts that are not your individual self, right? Like, if I now combine this part A with this part B, C, D, E, F, I'll make a little monster like this. I won't make back the individual so nicely as if I compose these parts back together, get the union of them. So this doesn't look like this anymore, right? So there was a big debate on, and it's interesting, Gastev, for example, who wrote an influential book called How to Work, where he proposed different ways of measuring how we work and analyzing how you do everything. He was a choreographer and a poet. He was the head of the Central Labor Institute, because they had the intuition that the capitalist production process is like a laboratory where you are exploring this sort of what we call resolutions, right? Ways of cutting up labor use to the size that makes a difference to that process. And that this cutting up process doesn't need to respect recognizable divisions or recognizable resolutions. It can the very fact that machines can be made to accomplish tasks that we couldn't, the moment that we are mixed up with machines, we start seeing ourselves as composed of things that don't look human, right? So this quote is very telling of this. It says, the modern machine possesses its own laws of pulsation, right? Rhythm, functioning, and relaxation. Laws that do not stand in conformity with the rhythm of the human organism. The world of the machine, of the mechanical equipment, of urbanized labor, produces specially connected collectives, begets certain types of people. And big types here can mean, so these are people who we must accept, just as we accept the machine, though we must not smash their heads on its gears. We must bring some kind of equalizing coefficient into the machine's iron disciplinary pressure, and engineer human psychology according to this new historical factor of mechanism. So he was all for it. He was saying there is a real phenomenological decomposition of the human in a productive process, capitalist or Taylorist production process. And we should, and that plasticity of humans to be decomposed in inhuman ways should be explored and not kind of feared. But it was a bit of a substantialist and very heroic view. I would like to talk about it. I don't think we'll have time. And it was a bit kind of counter argumented by the Time League, headed by Plato, of all people, who weren't really keen on this romantic view, where it was all about merging man and machine and the sort of new man and so on. They were more about, they inverted the order. They didn't say that new technologies and machinery were teaching us how to organize, but because, and it was more Marxist in the sense, first you get social organization and then machines that fit it, that it's the organization itself, which is a technology we need to learn how to use better. And so they studied a lot of work processes. You can see some interesting little pictures and the way that they were trying to understand how tasks are divided and so on. And the thing that interested them was more how different forms of organization can produce different effects, rather than learning the organization of machines and importing them to humans, right? So organization for the Time League was a more primitive concept than technical development. And I think that that's a big shift between the two. But just to conclude, I'll leave, we had this crazy things here at the end, but I think we can go back to them some other time. But perhaps to conclude, I'm not sure if Dennis also wants to add something, but to go back to the work songs, the interesting thing is that historically, the moment that these machines start setting up the rhythm in the workspace, you no longer need workers to connect, to sync up their labor, because the machine syncs their labor up by its own rhythm. The sound needs to be, people say a lot of different things, like it becomes first impossible to sing because it's too loud, the machinery. But even when it's not too loud, you need to be quiet because you need to listen to the machine, because the machine might go faulty, or you need to like make more precise how you interact with it depending on how it's wobbling or whatever. So nobody sings, right? So there is a point where workers go silent. That it correlates with the rise of machinery in modern factories. Up to that point, workspaces were the primary place where people created music in a lot of cultures, especially European ones. And after that, it becomes a sort of place where you bring music from the outside, right? So you have programs like in 43 in the BBC, music while you work. So radio programs made for people to listen while they work. And the connection between music and labor becomes the whole debate of who chooses the song, the psychological function of the song, of easing work, and it's very extrinsic and very ideological as well. So I think it's, I mean, I'm not sure if you want to add something to this crazy last development here, Dennis, before we just try to perhaps say something about this.
I just wanted one thing, which is to point out that in the conversion from cooperation to machine, we also have a kind of a paradox here, because by converting it to the machine, meaning a means of production, we no longer can produce value, right?
Yeah.
So that's also interesting. Like you're trying to chase for this essence of cooperation, let's say, the thing that would make it priceable and therefore reproducible. But by acquiring that, you also lose the ability to produce more value, because and the connection between this movement and competition for share of total social capital is interesting.
This is crucial, because I mean, I think you're definitely right. We should say this, because the moment that this moves to means of production, what happens? It means that this product gets cheaper. If this product is part of the simple consumables of labor, this set goes cheaper. And for some other productive process, labor is now cheaper, and therefore exploitation goes up. So the moment that you get this sort of machine industrial system in place, one process creates the conditions for another surplus extraction. It doesn't happen inside, it happens between. You see, right? If you're increasing productivity through machines, well, you still employ the same laborers. You're not exploiting them more, you're just gonna produce for cheaper. You don't get to extract more surplus because of that. But if that production process is connected with another, and that other is using the people who are consuming your product for cheaper, you can pay them less and extract more surplus, right? So I'm just saying this because one critique a lot of people make of Marx, though it's more complicated than what I'm saying, is that you don't see higher degrees of profitability where you have more automation. So it's weird that where you have more labor intensity, which is kind of outdated, because supposedly through competition, industries should want to move towards automation. But the more you automate, the less workers are employing, the less surplus you can extract. So the more automated industries makes the less automated ones more profitable. It's a weird cycle. Like it's not, so it requires it to look from a larger dynamic to start relocating surplus extraction and things like this. And there's also something else that's worth saying, that once this, Marx says this, and I think it's one of the most important parts. He says, once you introduce this sort of rhythm to production, like many machines consuming huge amounts of means of production and producing huge amounts, the crucial factor is not the factory, is that everyone else who is supplying the factory, but it's no longer, it's not yet an industrial supplier. It's like a manufacturer, house workers or whatever, but everyone is supplying the factory, or plantations in Americans' slave system. They are now obliged to supply in a greater rhythm, and they therefore start exploiting their workers in greater intensity. So the event of the factory is not really what happens inside of it, is how what happens inside propagates through every other production system around it. So I'm like slave owners in America start treating their slaves differently and worse because they need to produce more to fulfill the demands of the factory. So the rhythm kind of propagates through society, which is great. I think that idea of propagation connects with the end part here, right? This is just a summary of something we didn't explore in the primer, which just, let's say, In the primer, we actually go all the way here, perhaps, but it's only at the end, right? This is the thing you guys remember. We have M1 becoming M2, right? Which we call a weak point. Some level of value is set to a higher level of value. And for this point to hold, you need to go into production and find a way to explore labor, right, below its value and bring this up somehow, right? Give it an existence at the level of value. So it's not enough to go down, which is, let's say, what the production process is doing when it divides tasks, looks for more efficient ways, but then you need to map it back onto value and money, right? If you can do this, you can make a point in Badiou's sense hold. So we could call labor or the productive site, the productive unit, as a site where you can explore parts of labor in search of non-priced parts that you can bring up to the product and make a point hold, right? So we could call this a weak point because it's internal to a world, not bridging two worlds. We can call an organ of capitalism a set of productive cycles with holding points like this, right? And other organs are connected to one organ through competition, right? The fact, for example, that I found a way to exploit labor, a new way to exploit labor, propagates through society, through competition. Now others need to also employ this, which is called the average organic composition of capital. Marx himself calls it organic. So we're at the level of organs, how points can create some basic internal consistency, which is the expanded reproduction, and create through competition and sort of spaced out consistency between productive endeavors, right? And you can have bodies, which is like corporations, which rather than be divided by competition, almost include competitions inside of them through monopoly. So you can have many different parts of sectors that are exploiting in different ways and so on, and you can make one consist where it's faulty by using the value of another and so on, right? And make this whole thing consist as a complete body that at the same time is also guaranteeing that some forms of some resolutions of labor are kept as relevant, right? It's also inducing new ways of exploiting this back, right? So we can add this whole process here. Exploration of unformed parts of labor, indexing them into value, internal consistency through reproduction of capital, external consistency through competition, concrete unity through monopoly, and then induction, right, of new points through further reproduction of this and increased growth, right? I added a kind of a zooming in into this part here, just to say that, well, there are ways of reindexing this surplus in ways that are not on TC. So for example, right, this is LP and this will be LPS. And it can be reindexed as LPS, right, as surplus labor by TC. It treats this surplus that exists within the parts of labor as surplus labor, but this surplus can be conformed into the contract layer or the state layer in terms of laws, in terms of other contracts that people establish, in terms of prohibitions or whatever. For example, the workday prohibits you exploiting this above some barrier, right? This can also be conformed into the community layer. You can treat it as social bonds. So it's not that we are more than ourselves in production. It's actually that we find our community. So it's also a way of reducing that cooperative surplus. It's not the reduction to labor time, a surplus labor time, but it's a reduction to a sort of reinforcing of a community that already existed, or establishment of an enemy who I say is usurping the surplus from me. Those are layer conforming, right? They're assigning a value to this which doesn't exist in the commodity world, giving them some level of existence in other layers. And I think that this establishes pretty much where we are heading, because we're not interested in this being absorbed as surplus labor, nor simply conformed, but that it can inform some other notion of points, right? It gives the form for some other process. And I think that the development we produced today that is interesting is that we show that it's not that what's here is not an unstructured black box with infinite depth and God knows what's on a worker's mind while they're working, all their preferences, all their personal resolutions, right? Like the ways you can predicate on a worker. The interesting part that is below here is the collective worker. That's the part that never gets to appear as such, right? So, and it has structure. So it's an interesting place to imagine a sort of unlocalized or indifferentiated structure that is necessary to capitalism, but never gets to make a difference on its own, has been the ground for talking about other ways of composing this stuff, right? With the added fact that we saw that competition and monopoly play very important parts in making a point consist in capitalism in a larger scale. And we already have a sort of cooperative, but a very specific figure of cooperation, right? Cooperation has a power to decompose people into parts that they don't recognize themselves as, which I think is what the Soviets realized. There is a, rather than the sort of communal version of cooperation, which I think is indexed here, or class-like theory of cooperation, which is we are owners of rights. What the Soviets found that was the true, let's say, substance of cooperation is a kind of very dangerous power, right? When you cooperate with people, you create a totality that sees you in a way that you don't see yourself. I feel like the Gustaf's enchantment with machines is still, it's poorer than what cooperation is capable, because it's very seduced by the cyborg-like ways of seeing parts of people from the perspective of parts of machines. But it's kind of like being seduced by money into seeing everything as a monetary exchange. It is enticing to the imagination, but it's not politically very powerful. Like it doesn't, you cannot do very much, perhaps, right? So, but there is this idea, like this underlying idea that cooperation implies finding weird connections that the proper resolution to measure and evaluate them will not necessarily respect the ways that we measure ourselves as individuals, right? And I think that this is a nice insight into the sort of backbone or fundamental idea of cooperation that can lead to an alternative to competition versus monopoly as propagators of points in society, of new consistency, of logical dependence between endeavors and so on, into something that would have some form of cooperation inside of it, you know?
Gabriel, do you have any references for that debate that you'd recommend to read?
I'll post them in the group. I think for Gustav, there is a lot of stuff. He's very interesting figure, and there's a lot of interesting articles and so on. For the Time League, I only found one article, very short, and all the work of this guy is not translated. It's only in Russian, and I couldn't find any of it. Like I only had this one essay, but I'll send it to you guys as well, of course. Yeah.
Yeah, this is very, very, very interesting in terms of explaining the primer Yeah, thank you, Gabriel.
I hope it makes it more, I mean, it felt a bit more connected to discussions by taking this route, right? It felt like it has something to add, you know? But
it really made clear, I think, like the like minimal mereological structure of the process aspect of it, along like the scale sensitivity. I think makes a lot more sense to me now. But keep these slides on the website. Yeah.
Yeah, of
I
course.
want to take a look at them later.
Yeah, I think this really developed the stuff nicely. It makes a lot of sense. It's starting to like it's getting easier to imagine how to take it into other areas. And I thought it also like I think it kind of helps also clarify a lot of positions. Like I think like the analysis of cooperation helps explain like why things like unions have limited capacity when you kind of give up the ontological notion that workers kind of have some inherent power and you kind of look at the cooperative structure kind of like makes sense of things in a lot of ways.
Yeah, I really think that we could do a nice analysis of like different trade union structures based on what is said to be the totality. Like we are the totality of the skilled workers of an area, of a type, and then we create a community based on being workers of the same type. Or is the trade union based not on the trade, right? I mean, trade union in itself already spells out that it determines the resolution before, right? By trade. But there might be also like nuances.
It seems like this would really let you do something like a I guess like comparative like mereology between different like forms of organization, right?
Yeah, I think so too.
It gives tools to compare how they look at their parts and wholes, I think.
Yeah,
yeah,
I think
we give
so
actual methodology to institutional analysis, which so far is mostly just like better or worse descriptions.
Yeah. Yeah, I really think it could contribute to that. And I think that it sets up the problem, which is once you divide it in terms of productive processes, are even in capitalism. I mean, Dennis always mentions this text called the theory of the firm, which starts with the question of why don't we use the market system inside firms if it's such a perfect system? And it develops on top of this question. And I think that we have a slightly different answer perhaps, but the question is interesting because capitalism would, in our view, if you take this image here, right, you should think of it as a sort of monster that we can draw it as a monster. Like it has a mouth here that adapts, right? It can contract and expand to suck on the right resolution, right? And to do this, you need an opening. You cannot have here. So here you have a big eye.
Really quick though. It's good to note that Sears actually tried that. The implementing capitalism like within the structure, and I think it kind of led to the company like imploding on itself.
That's really interesting.
Yeah, I saw a thing about it recently.
Yeah, I remember that.
Because like basically what happened, different like sectors of the company ended up competing against each other and keeping secrets from one another, and then instead of buying Sears things, they would go to the outside and outsource all of their products.
Yeah.
So it became a whole mess, and it basically led to Sears going under. That's why we don't have Sears anymore.
Yeah, I remember reading that case study, and you can see that. I mean, I know I did a very, very terrible drawing here, but the fact is that the crucial thing is that capitalism needs to, let's say, have a place where it can, let's say, exploit partial ordering of things, right? You want places where things are not fully ordered and measurable by money, because those places are like fish nets for value, right? You're fishing for non-priced parts of things. And that fish net needs to be like a lattice. It cannot be just like a ruler. And once you get to kind of catch things into this lattice structure of simultaneously parallel combination of works around the world or whatever, then the second task begins, which is stitching it back to a total order, right? So that's why you have two moments here, to explore this and stitch it back. This concerns labor use, right? And this concerns labor time, which is Q, right? But this is crucial. So it has a bit of a gaping and changing place, and that place are firms, companies, and so on. That's why the workspace structure cannot be the same as the circulatory structure, right, of exchange, because you want to be able to unpack and explore ways of decomposing and recomposing parts of labor. And if you only could decompose it in transitive subsets of subsets of subsets, so that they are totally ordered in a way, you wouldn't get very far. You would get all the way as far as, you know, what Marx called absolute surplus value, which is, well, I make you work for longer. That's what I can do. So I think it's nice to imagine it as this monster where everything is kind of, the cells are all about, you know, exchange and money, but organs are competing against each other to make it like function, and the mouth is like digging, you know, through stuff and breaking things apart and see if they can be put back together in different ways. Is that actually a terrible picture now that I've
It's a terrible picture.
I don't know. I mean, the experience I had working for one of those monsters, I worked as a cable guy for Comcast for a year, and they had a crisis. I won't go into all the details, but basically they had an issue where they realized they didn't know how we did our job, and they had to figure it out in order to keep managing. So 3 out of 5 days a week, we'd start the weeks with these meetings where our supervisor would actually, he would ask us questions trying to figure out how we made our customers more or less happy, because the company didn't have a way to look in on the individual techs and say, oh, this is what's working and what's not. And the techs would help each other. Like when I was getting trained, they'd pass on in one, you know, just conversation, this works and it doesn't. But there was no way for the company itself to actually like look at everything and then like systematize. So they had to create these very particular mouths, as you say, which they felt like it. Like my particular team did not like our supervisors, so we were the worst team about giving feedback. And so it was a very ineffective mouth, basically.
Yeah.
But some of the supervisors that were well liked by upper management were the ones who had good relationships with their workers and were constantly getting feedback about what was working out in the field. So I think that's actually a really like potent analogy about how things work.
Yeah, I think that, I mean, of course, the place where we stopped is still like early 20th century. I mean, today we have that in Brazil, nobody calls people workers anymore. They call them like collaborators, which in English I think sounds like you're a Nazi, but in Portuguese just means like you're not working for me, you're working with me. You know,
it's team members in the States.
Team members, things like this.
Yeah.
Which is all about, let's say, inside the workspace, again, creating the maximum connectivity. And at the moment you're going to leave the door, you're going to get wages, which are a function of time in a way, right? So this seems to be much richer movement between this net of complexity and how it gets mapped back onto value, you know, than simply an original analysis of Marx. But the way we're doing it becomes a continuum, right? You can get the resolution problem at the very origin of labor time from a broader sense of labor use, and then get something more complex than simple labor exploitation of time now with this weird capitalist, cooperative, human resources things, right? Even the idea of human resource, it's again, it's like human is like a decomposing material, right? You can do things with it if it's a resource. So I think it brings us more up to speed to the things that are visible in the productive sphere today, you know?
I think it also gives us a way to see how the other two exchange functions map in too. Once we have this overall structure of a corporation, again, like with Comcast, they had these posters all around the building with various glorified pictures of supposedly workers, with the slogan being "I am Comcast," which is very clearly like TA, right? And then if you look at the actual organizational structure of corporations, they follow from the military and the state more than from classic manufacturing. So you can really see how a corporation is that kind of like abstract model, then incorporating TA and TB as well to like streamline it.
I mean, I think that what you said now really, I mean, in the future, somebody could try this. Like we mentioned the work songs as music and rhythm, musical structure and rhythm participating in the consistency of the labor process, right? But if you just move it to the side a bit, you get music in military, where music is can also be immanent to military organization, but not exactly for the same reasons, you know? And again, music can be used for communal reasons like trance, ritual, or whatever, which is also music being repurposed in a way, but it's neither the way the military does it or the productive system. So if anyone would like scratch the surface of that, it would be a really cool way to distinguish TA, TB, and TC, you know, with a common object in a way. If that makes any sense.
No, it does. And you'd have to be interested in them take that and link it to like the idea of generic art from Badiou, like the actual art form of music, and then these kind of like economic instantiations of music.
Yeah, I mean, because you can always ask the question, okay, I don't care if it was a work song. How is it structured? What is it doing to the musical material? That's a separate question that you can never really raise, right? You might have made the worst musical propaganda in the world or the best work song for the international. You can never really erase completely the question, okay, but is it thinking musically? It might, you know, by contingency or whatever. But yeah, I totally agree with you. Yeah, guys. Anyway, now that we have a snapshot of the monster, I think we can all go have dinner or something.
Amazing work.
All right.
Amazing work, both of you. Thank you so much.
I'm glad we managed
Thank
to
you.
cover it in one meeting. I know it was very long.
Good night, y'all.
Otherwise, it would be too much.
Yeah.
Guys, see you later.
Good meeting.
Take
Bye.
care.
Great meeting. I see you.